Welcome to Cozy Vintage Studio. Tonight, you'll drift to sleep in 1940s Paris, where soft rain paints the streets silver, and a small bakery glows like a lantern against the grey. Inside, flour drifts through warm light, and every stranger who steps in from the drizzle. Our story follows a humble baker, his young apprentice Colette, and the quiet rhythm of their autumn day as the city hums beyond the fogged windows. Somewhere between trays of croissants and cups of café au lait, a face appears, one that hasn't been seen in 30 years. Stay with us, breathe slowly, and let's begin the story. The first light of the day slid gently across the rooftops of Paris, finding its way through the mist and the narrow chimneys that still smoked from the night before. The rain had started before dawn, steady, deliberate, and soft enough to blur the cobblestones until they gleamed like black glass. Beneath a striped awning on Rue de la Madeleine, a small bakery waited for the city to wake. Its sign, hand-painted and slightly faded, read Boulangerie Marcel et Fils. The paint peeled a little at the edges, but the scent that drifted from within was warm, alive, and certain. Inside, the air was a mixture of yeast, wood smoke, and the faint citrus tang of yesterday's polish. Marcel, the baker, was already awake, rolling dough on the wooden counter that had been his father's. The rhythm of his movements matched the rain outside, slow, patient, and sure. He did not speak yet. He seldom did before the first batch rose. The silence of the early hour was a friend that helped him think. The dough pressed against his palms with familiar weight, soft and elastic, like memory made tangible. A kettle whistled on the back stove. Henri, the quiet helper, lifted it off the heat before it screamed too loudly. He was tall, his sleeves rolled past his elbows, his dark hair already powdered with flour. The two men worked without words. Henri placed a tray of baguettes near the oven, and Marcel brushed them with milk, the strokes smooth and careful. Steam began to bloom against the cold window panes, turning the glass opaque. Outside, Paris was a blur of umbrellas and hurried coats. Inside, the world was made of warmth and light. By 6 o'clock, the first bell of the distant tram sounded through the drizzle. Marcel looked up, listening. Every morning, that bell reminded him that the city was moving again, that people would soon come looking for coffee, warmth, or simply the company of other souls waiting for the rain to pass. He set another log in the small stove near the door and adjusted the lamp that hung above the counter. Its amber glow softened the walls, revealing photographs in wooden frames. His late parents, the bakery's opening day, and a group of smiling soldiers who had once crowded this same counter during the war. He wiped the dust from one frame, his thumb pausing on the image of himself, young, hopeful, unaware of how time could stretch and contract like dough. 30 years had passed since that photograph, and though Paris had changed, the bakery had not. The same creak lived in the floorboards, the same scent clung to the walls, the same rain seemed to fall each October. Perhaps that was why people came back. Perhaps they needed something that did not move too quickly. Henri opened the shutters, and a gust of damp air swept inside. The smell of wet stone mingled with the sweetness of baking bread. "It's a heavy rain," he murmured. Marcel nodded, slipping the first tray into the oven. A hiss of steam filled the room. "It will keep them indoors," he said, "but it will bring them here." He knew this kind of weather, the kind that made people linger longer over a cup, that made strangers talk because silence felt too big. The clock above the door ticked towards 7. Across the street, a newspaper boy shouted headlines into the mist. Few listened. The rain absorbed his voice, turning it into music rather than news. Marcel checked the pastries cooling on the rack, croissants golden, brioche soft and shining. He arranged them on porcelain plates, not out of necessity but habit. His mother had taught him that presentation mattered, even when no one was watching. In the corner near the window stood a small table with 2 chairs. The tablecloth was freshly ironed, and a single rose sat in a glass jar. It was Colette's doing. She would arrive soon, always a few minutes late, always apologetic and laughing. Marcel thought of her umbrella, always too small for the rain, and smiled to himself. The girl brought chatter and light into the quiet, and though she sometimes burned the coffee, he would not trade her for 10 perfect assistants. He stepped to the doorway for a moment. The street stretched like a silver ribbon between the rows of tall, soot-coloured buildings. Water gathered at the edges of the pavement, carrying reflections of lamplight and passing boots. The smell of roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the block reached him faintly. Paris in the rain, he thought, has a way of forgiving. The city slowed to a heartbeat, and even the hurried found themselves pausing beneath an awning, listening to the rhythm of droplets on canvas. He returned inside and sprinkled flour across the counter like snow. The pattern it left reminded him of distant winters, when his wife would dust the same surface while humming old chansons. For a moment, he almost heard her voice in the rain. Then he blinked, and the sound was gone, replaced by the kettle's soft rumble. Henri set down a tray and began to cut thin slices of apple for the tarts. "Will Colette bring the cream today?" he asked. Marcel answered without looking up. "She always forgets it once before she remembers." They both smiled. The camaraderie between them was built on small rituals, the knowing of each other's habits, the shared silences, the occasional joke that broke through like sunlight between clouds. The oven door opened, releasing a golden breath that rolled through the room. Marcel leaned close, inspecting each loaf as though reading an old letter. Perfect crust, even colour, nothing rushed. He lifted one baguette and tapped it lightly. It sang back, hollow and crisp. Satisfaction settled over him, like a warm coat. He placed it gently on the rack, letting the aroma fill every corner. The scent reached the doorway, wandered outside, and mingled with the rain. Passers-by slowed, noses lifting slightly, curiosity guiding their steps. A woman with a parcel paused by the window, fogged her reflection with her breath, and smiled. She did not come in, not yet. But Marcel saw her hesitate, torn between the grey street and the glow inside. He wiped his hands and waited. The bakery was ready now, pastries aligned, lamps steady, warmth enough for anyone seeking shelter. He took a final look around, listening to the symphony of small sounds, the crackle of firewood, the faint tapping of rain, Henri's quiet hum. Everything felt balanced, expectant. Outside, a carriage rattled over the stones and faded into distance. The street grew momentarily still. Marcel turned the sign on the door from fermé to ouvert and stepped back. The first bell above the frame jingled softly in the empty air, a sound like a promise. He glanced toward the clock once more. Soon Colette would burst in, dripping and cheerful. Her umbrella turned inside out by the stubborn wind. Soon the day would gather colour, voices, laughter, the stories that wandered in with each wet coat. For now, though, the world was suspended between one breath and the next. The baker leaned on the counter, folded his arms and listened. The rain played on the windows like a quiet orchestra. The smell of bread thickened, comforting, familiar. In that still moment before the door opened, before the chatter began, he felt the calm that only early morning could bring, the calm that told him, without words, that the day would be full of people seeking warmth and perhaps a bit of home. And outside, the rain kept falling, steady and sure, as though Paris itself refused to wake too quickly. By the time the church bell struck 7, the rain had softened into a finer mist, the kind that lingered in the air rather than falling. The street outside shimmered, puddles trembling under the delicate rhythm of droplets. The smell of roasted chestnuts drifted closer now, mingling with the aroma of butter and yeast from within the bakery. Inside, Marcel adjusted the brass lamps above the counter, polishing their glass shades until they cast a steady amber light. The morning had truly begun. He lifted a tray of croissants from the cooling rack and placed them neatly in the front window, one beside another, careful to face their golden crescents outward. Presentation mattered. He could still hear his mother's voice, reminding him, if the bread looks loved, people will love it back. It was an old superstition, but one he'd never outgrown. Henri swept the floor quietly, his broad shoulders bent under his apron. The broom whispered across the boards, catching bits of flour that glowed faintly in the morning light. He did not speak much. His silences were almost musical, but when he looked up at Marcel, there was contentment in his eyes. He liked the order of things, the predictability of the oven's hum, the warmth that came with honest work. "Coffee's ready," Henri said softly. The rich scent filled the air, deep and earthy. Marcel poured himself a cup and took a slow sip. The warmth travelled through him, steadying his thoughts. Another day, another rhythm of baking, serving, listening. The bakery was not merely a place of bread. It was a small refuge stitched into the city's fabric, a living corner of Paris where the rain outside could not intrude. He walked to the door and stepped out beneath the awning. The sky hung low, grey as slate. The narrow street reflected the lamps from the buildings across the way, and the quiet hum of morning traffic began to rise. Bicycles, carts, an early taxi grumbling through the puddles. Marcel nodded to the flower vendor, setting up her stand 2 doors down. She was arranging chrysanthemums, autumn's farewell bloom, yellow and deep red against the dull morning. She waved back, and he smiled, his face creasing like old parchment. Behind him, Henri wiped down the counter and began arranging cups in perfect rows. The bakery smelled like comfort. A faint melody drifted from the radio on the shelf, something soft and crackling. Perhaps Edith Piaf, or a waltz from the year before. Marcel listened for a moment, then hummed along under his breath. He turned the sign on the door once more, just to be sure it read "Ouvert," and opened the door wide. The bell above it chimed, a single bright note that echoed faintly down the street. The sound seemed to invite the day in. The first visitor was not a customer, but a cat, sleek and grey, padding across the threshold as though it owned the place. It shook the rain from its coat and sat primly near the stove, tail curling around its paws. Marcel chuckled. "Another regular," he murmured. Henri brought a saucer of milk without needing to be asked. The cat lapped it noiselessly, purring like a small motor. Moments later, the second bell rang, the sound of Colette's arrival. She entered in a rush of damp air and laughter, her hair escaping from beneath a beret, her coat dripping rain onto the floor. Her umbrella was, as always, inside out. She closed it with exaggerated drama and sighed, smiling. The wind hates me, Monsieur Marcel. It hates everyone equally, Marcel replied, taking the umbrella and shaking it outside. But it seems to have particular affection for you. Henri grinned, passing her a towel. You're late, he said, though there was no reproach in his voice. I am early for tomorrow, she countered. Her cheeks were pink from the cold, her hands trembling slightly as she rubbed them together, the stove's warmth wrapped around her like an embrace. Marcel handed her a cup of coffee. Drink, he said simply. She obeyed, eyes closing for a moment at the first sip. The steam fogged her lashes. Perfect, she whispered. Outside, a tram bell rang again. Closer this time, through the window, they could see umbrellas gathering near the corner. Footsteps quickening on the wet stone. The day was about to fill itself. Marcel adjusted his apron, smoothed his sleeves, and nodded toward the counter. Let's open for the rain, he said. Colette laughed. For the rain? Yes. It sends us the best kind of company, the ones who stay. The first customer entered soon after, a postman drenched from shoulders to boots. He removed his cap, shaking out droplets. Morning, he said, smiling apologetically. Marcel gestured toward the fire. Sit, my friend. The bread's just out of the oven. The man took a seat near the window, sighing deeply as the warmth reached him. Colette brought him a croissant and a cup of coffee, setting them down with quiet care. He murmured his thanks, then simply sat, watching the rain trickle down the glass. The world outside blurred into watercolor, and the bakery became an island of light. Soon another guest arrived. A woman carrying flowers wrapped in newspaper, then an old man with a newspaper of his own. A young couple followed, whispering to each other, their laughter soft but constant. The bell above the door became a gentle rhythm of arrival. Every few minutes it sang, and with each note the air grew fuller of voices, of heat, of the smell of sugar, caramelizing. Henri moved among them, silently, carrying trays, wiping spills, nodding in gratitude when thanked. Colette's laughter stitched between the tables, her voice bright and lilting. Marcel stood behind the counter, slicing loaves, refilling cups, watching it all unfold. He loved this part of the morning, the bloom of life that filled the small room until even the rain seemed to lean closer against the windows to listen. Yet beneath the hum of conversation, a quiet thought lingered. He had seen so many faces through the years that sometimes he imagined they might all return at once, every customer who had ever passed through that door. He wondered if he would recognize them, or if time would have changed them beyond recall. Perhaps, he thought, someone from long ago would indeed return one day, just to see if the bakery still stood. The bell rang again, and a gust of wind swept through. Marcel looked up, half expecting what, he didn't know. Only a courier hurried in, clutching a soaked envelope. Delivery for Monsieur Marcel, he said, his breath clouding the air. Marcel wiped his hands and took it. No return address. The paper was thick, the ink slightly smudged. He placed it on the counter, unopened, as the messenger disappeared again into the rain. Are you not going to read it? Colette asked. Later, Marcel said. The bread mustn't wait. She raised an eyebrow, but said nothing more. The morning moved steadily on. The bell rang, the oven sighed, the clock ticked, the envelope remained on the counter, a small mystery amid the clutter of cups and crumbs. Marcel caught himself glancing at it, now and then, his hands never stopping their work. The handwriting was familiar, though he could not place it. It stirred something, distant, uncertain. He took another tray of pastries from the oven. Their scent washed over him, rich and sweet, erasing the thought for now. The cat stretched by the stove. The rain tapped its steady rhythm, and the bakery continued to glow like a harbour against the grey. For those inside, the world beyond the glass ceased to exist. There was only warmth, conversation, and the slow comfort of time passing exactly as it should. And yet as the clock neared 9, the letter on the counter still waited, its seal unbroken, its secret quietly breathing beneath the hum of the day. Outside, the rain began again, finer, colder, more insistent. Inside, the bell above the door chimed once more. By mid-morning, the rhythm of the bakery had settled into a gentle hum. Outside, the rain fell in thinner threads now, stitching faint lines across the fogged windows. Inside, the lamps glowed with their steady amber light, halos reflected in the glass display of pastries. Steam curled from coffee cups and mingled with the scent of baked apples, cinnamon, and sugar. The cat still dozed by the stove, tail flicking lazily with each crackle of wood. Colette stood near the counter, sleeves rolled to her elbows, her dark hair tied back with a faded blue ribbon. The earlier chill of the rain had left her cheeks flushed and her smile bright. She had taken it upon herself to rearrange the trays so that every pastry faced the same direction, an act of precision that made Henri laugh quietly. "If the croissants could see you now," he teased, "they'd think they were soldiers." "They're better behaved than soldiers," she replied, and much sweeter. Marcel, hearing this, pretended to frown. Less talk, more glaze. But his tone carried no weight. He watched her move between tables, swift and graceful, despite the slippery floorboards. She had learned the small choreography of service, the way to refill a cup without interrupting a conversation, the soft tone to use with customers who sought silence more than speech. At one table, the postman read his newspaper slowly, his coat steaming on the back of his chair. Near the window, the flower seller nibbled at a brioche, her fingers still faintly yellow from pollen. A pair of students argued about politics between sips of espresso. The bakery was alive now, each table a small island of stories, each voice part of a low, comforting music. Colette liked this time of day best, when everything seemed to breathe together. She set down a plate of fresh tarts and caught her reflection in the window, half blurred by rain, half real in the golden light. She thought briefly of her village outside the city, of her mother's hands dusted with flour, of the laughter that used to fill their kitchen. Paris had felt lonely at first, but the bakery had softened the edges of that loneliness. "Colette," Marcel called. "You forgot the cream again," she gasped, spinning toward him. "No, it's on the shelf. Wait, no it's not." She looked around in mock despair. Henri smirked, as predicted. Marcel shook his head, but smiled. "We'll survive. The world doesn't end for lack of cream." Colette rushed to the pantry anyway, searching among jars of jam and tins of cocoa. She found the small jug behind a stack of flour sacks and raised it triumphantly. "See, the world is safe again." The customers nearby chuckled, charmed by her earnestness. Marcel poured the cream into a porcelain bowl and set it beside the tarts. "Crisis averted," he said, handing her the spoon. A flash of light outside caught Colette's eye. A passing car sending a wave of rainwater onto the pavement. She leaned closer to the window, and noticed an elderly man sheltering beneath a newspaper. His coat was soaked, his hat tilted against the wind. For a moment, their eyes met through the glass. Then he moved on, disappearing into the curtain of rain. "Poor soul," she murmured. "No umbrella." Henri looked up from his work. No umbrella, but he has determination. That counts for something. The bell above the door rang again. Breaking the moment, a young woman entered, holding the hand of a small boy whose curls were plastered to his forehead. The mother's smile was weary, but her eyes softened as she inhaled the warmth. "2 chocolate chaud, please," she said. "Of course," Colette answered, leading them to a corner table. She brought the drinks a few minutes later, whipped cream piled high, and placed a small cookie beside the child's cup. His face lit up instantly. "Merci, mademoiselle," he said, crumbs already on his chin. Marcel watched the exchange from behind the counter. These small gestures, so ordinary, so human, were what made the place feel alive. Every act of kindness was another layer of warmth against the chill of the world outside. For a brief while, everything was simple. Cups clinked, pages turned. The radio whispered another slow waltz. Henri wiped the counter with rhythmic precision, while Colette's laughter rippled like sunlight through the air. Then the door opened again, and a gust of wind swept through the bakery, scattering napkins and snuffing one of the candles. Colette hurried to close it, but not before the rain spattered across the floor. "It's turning again," she said, looking toward the street. The sky had deepened to a metallic grey, the kind that promised another long storm. Marcel moved to the window, studying the clouds. "Good," he said softly. "It will keep them here a little longer." When he turned back, Colette was humming, something soft and wistful. It was a tune he recognized, though he couldn't name it. He realized it was the same melody his wife used to hum while folding napkins long ago, before Colette was even born. The sound reached him like a thread pulled from memory. For a moment, he let it linger before shaking himself back to the present. Henri slid a tray of raisin buns into the oven. "We'll need more flour soon," he said. "I'll check the storage after the rush." "Take your time," Marcel replied. "The rain will do the talking until then." Colette looked up from wiping a table. "Do you ever get tired of it?" "The rain?" "Yes, it never seems to stop." Marcel smiled. "I don't mind. It makes the world quieter, and quiet helps us listen to the things we'd otherwise forget." She considered that for a moment, then nodded. "Maybe that's why people come here," she said. "Not for the bread, but for the quiet." "Perhaps," he said, "though the bread helps." They both laughed. The sound mingled with the hiss of steam from the oven and the steady patter outside. The postman stood to leave, buttoning his coat. "Keep the change, monsieur," he said, leaving a few francs on the counter. "If it rains all day, I'll be back." "You'll have a seat waiting," Marcel replied. When the door closed behind him, Colette looked toward the counter, where the unopened envelope still rested beside the register. "You still haven't read that letter," she said quietly. "No," Marcel admitted. "Some things are better when you wait for the right moment." Henri glanced between them, curious but silent. The baker's gaze stayed fixed on the envelope for a long second before he turned away. "Let's not keep the tarts waiting," he said. The smell of sugar deepened as they worked. The cut stirred and stretched. The clock ticked past 10, and the morning light shifted toward gold. Outside, the rain softened again, as if catching its breath. The bakery, alive and content, held its own small world within its walls, a world of warmth, patience, and the quiet certainty that stories often begin where days seem most ordinary. And somewhere in the drizzle, a tram bell rang once more, distant, familiar, like a heartbeat beneath the city's rain-soaked skin. By late morning, the rain had gathered strength once more, turning the narrow street into a slow-moving stream. From the window, the bakery looked like a painting, amber light glowing against the dark grey world beyond. The bell above the door chimed again and again, marking the steady rhythm of arrivals. Each ring brought a new burst of damp air, a new story trailing behind it. The first to enter after the postman's departure was a young man carrying a sketchbook under his arm. His coat was threadbare, his scarf spotted with rain, but his eyes carried that particular brightness of someone who had spent too much time watching the world rather than joining it. He hesitated by the door, blinking through the fog on his spectacles. "Come in, monsieur," Marcel called from behind the counter. "There's warmth enough for everyone." The young man smiled faintly, closed his umbrella, and stepped inside. His shoes left watery footprints across the tiles. Colette guided him to the table near the window, the one the painter would soon make his own. "Would you like coffee or chocolate?" she asked. "Just a croissant and silence," he said softly, as though silence were a luxury he could finally afford. "As you wish," she replied with a grin. "We have both fresh." She brought his order and left him to his thoughts. He opened his sketchbook, flipping through pages filled with hurried charcoal lines, faces, rooftops, cafe scenes. Soon his pencil began to move again, tracing the curve of the window, the shape of the cat near the stove, the warm blur of people gathered beneath the lamps. His hand moved quickly, but his breathing slowed. The bakery had that effect on people. It drew out their quiet selves. Another gust of wind pushed the door open, ushering in an elderly woman with a bright red umbrella and an even brighter voice. "Ah, the rain, it never ends," she declared, shaking droplets from her hat. Colette hurried over with a towel. "Sit by the fire, madame. We'll dry the day out of you." The woman laughed. "Dry the day out of me? How poetic. You should be writing books, not washing cups." "Perhaps one day," Colette said, smiling, as she led her to a seat. Marcel watched from the counter. He loved the way Colette could disarm anyone, how she could make a stranger feel as if they were returning home. It reminded him of his wife, who had once done the same. That thought warmed him and ached at the same time. He reached for a tray of bread rolls, arranging them neatly, while listening to the soft chorus of voices rising and falling across the room. The painter's pencil scratched faintly. The old woman hummed as she removed her gloves. Henry wiped the counter with slow, deliberate motions. Beyond the glass, Paris blurred into watercolor. Umbrellas, bicycles, reflections twisting through puddles. At the far table, a pair of school teachers shared a pot of tea and whispered over papers. They spoke of lessons, students, and the hope that the war years were truly behind them. Their laughter came easily, but carried a trace of weariness, as if they had learned to laugh, not from joy, but from relief. A soldier entered next, young, still carrying the discipline of the barracks in his shoulders. His uniform was damp and neatly pressed, his cap tilted at an exact angle. He nodded to Marcel with quiet respect. "May I sit?" "Of course, you've earned it," Marcel said, setting a steaming cup before him. The soldier wrapped his hands around it, letting the warmth seep through his gloves. He looked around the room, his gaze lingering on the painter, then on the cat, then finally settling on the loaf of bread cooling near the counter. "It smells like home," he said quietly. Marcel nodded. "That's what we hope for." Colette brought him a plate of brioche, golden and soft. He ate slowly, as if afraid that finishing too soon would break the spell of comfort that had settled over him. Outside, the rain intensified again, striking the awning in uneven rhythm. The sound filled the pauses between conversations. Every now and then, the bell over the door would chime as another visitor entered, a messenger boy, a tailor's apprentice, a woman selling violets from a basket. Each arrived dripping, shivering and smiling once they felt the oven's heat. Henri poured coffee in a steady stream, his motions unhurried. He had learned that people came here not for speed but for steadiness. The world outside moved too quickly. Inside, time folded itself differently. Marcel stepped into the back room for a moment, checking the next batch of dough. The smell of yeast rose thick and warm around him. He thought of his father's old advice. Bread is patience made visible. It was true. The dough could not be rushed, just as people could not be forced to heal faster than life allowed. When he returned to the front, he saw that Colette had lit another candle on the counter. Its flame trembled with every draught, but never went out. The painter's pencil paused long enough for him to take a sip of coffee, then continued, capturing the glow of that single candle. Henri leaned against the oven door, arms folded. "It's a good crowd today," he said. Marcel nodded. "The rain brings the best kind, the kind that stays, the kind that needs to come." For a while, they stood in comfortable silence, watching the bakery move like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Colette's laughter, a violin's trill, the doorbell, a soft cymbal, the hiss of steam, a steady percussion beneath it all. Around noon, the old woman with the red umbrella stood to leave. She handed Colette a few coins, then paused at the door. "You know," she said, "I only came in because the rain forced me, but I think I'll pretend it was my idea." Colette laughed. "Come again tomorrow, and we'll pretend the same." The woman winked and disappeared into the drizzle, her umbrella blooming open like a flower. The soldier left next, saluting as he went. The painter lingered, still sketching, still half in another world. Marcel wiped the counter, glancing at the unopened letter that remained near the register. Its edges curled slightly from the humidity. The ink had bled just enough to suggest it had waited too long for his attention. "Perhaps you should read it now," Colette said quietly, noticing his gaze. "Not yet," he replied. "The right moment hasn't arrived. You always say that." "And one day," Marcel said, smiling faintly, "I'll be right." The painter closed his sketchbook and approached the counter. "How much, monsieur?" Marcel waved his hand. "A sketch for a croissant. That seems fair." The young man blinked, surprised. "Truly?" Marcel nodded. "Leave me a drawing when you finish it. Something that smells of rain." The painter smiled, tucked the sketchbook under his arm, and promised to return. When the door closed behind him, the bakery seemed suddenly quieter, though not empty. The scent of sugar and bread filled every corner. The cat stretched by the stove, yawning wide. Colette leaned against the counter, watching the raindrops chase one another down the glass. "It's beautiful today," she said softly. Marcel looked toward the window, where the world was blurred but shining. "Yes," he said, "even the grey has its colours." And as he spoke, the church bells began to toll. noon, 12 deep notes rolling through the rain, marking another small eternity in the rhythm of their day. The rain did not stop at noon. It simply changed its character. It softened into a mist, light enough to hang in the air, yet constant enough to keep the streets glistening. Inside the bakery, the warmth deepened, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the scent of butter and coffee. The air shimmered faintly, alive with quiet energy. The young painter had settled near the window, his elbows resting on the small wooden table, where countless others had once sat and watched the world go by. He had been there nearly an hour now, sketching in silence while his croissant cooled, untouched beside him. Each line he drew seemed to pull a fragment of the morning into his notebook. The curve of the doorbell, the angle of Colette's smile, the steam rising from Aunt Henri's coffee cup. Marcel pretended not to watch him, but did so anyway. He admired that kind of focus, the way an artist could see what others only glanced at. There was something sacred about it, something that reminded him of baking. Both required patience, precision, and faith in small beginnings. Colette drifted between tables, clearing plates and chatting softly with customers. When she reached the painter's corner, she paused. "Do you mind if I look?" she asked, peering toward the page. He hesitated, then turned the sketchbook so she could see. On the paper, the bakery appeared transformed, less a shop and more a sanctuary, a space of golden light suspended in grey. "It looks kinder than it feels," he said, with a faint smile. "It feels kind enough to me," Colette replied. "Ah, but that's because you belong in it." The comment caught her off guard, and she blushed, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead. "You artists always speak like poets, only when the world is beautiful enough to deserve it," he said, already sketching again. Colette left him to his work, her steps lighter than before. Marcel had overheard the exchange, though he pretended not to. It reminded him of a younger time, of glances and laughter that meant more than words. He smiled quietly and adjusted a tray of rolls, letting the past slip back into its corner. Henri approached from the kitchen, carrying a pan of tarts, the smell of caramelized apples trailing behind him. "The painter's getting popular," he said. "3 people have already asked to see what he's drawing." "Let him be," Marcel replied. "Art grows best when it's left alone." Henri nodded. "Like bread." Exactly like bread. Outside, the wind shifted, blowing sheets of rain sideways against the windows. The glass quivered, and droplets ran together like small rivers. The painter stopped sketching for a moment and watched the storm, his pencil hovering mid-air. "Listen," he murmured, though no one had spoken to him. "The city is washing itself clean." Marcel followed his gaze. The rooftops across the street glistened, chimneys exhaling ribbons of pale smoke. Down the narrow lane, a woman in a green coat dashed for shelter, her shoes splashing through puddles. The sight made him think of the letter on the counter, still unopened, still patient. The bell chimed again. A man with a violin case entered, shaking the water from his shoulders. He was middle-aged, with the air of someone accustomed to being half recognized. "I saw your light," he said, smiling at Colette, "and your pastries smelled louder than the rain." "Then you had no choice but to come in," she replied. "Sit anywhere." He chose a table near the painter and set his case carefully on the chair beside him. "Do you mind if I dry my bow here?" "Not at all," said the painter, "but only if you play something after." The man chuckled. A fair bargain. Marcel, pretending to focus on the bread, watched the interruption unfold with quiet amusement. The violinist opened his case, revealing an instrument that had clearly seen years of travel. He inspected the strings, tightened one peg, and drew the bow across them once, softly, almost absent-mindedly. The note filled the room, delicate but steady, harmonizing with the patter of rain. Colette froze mid-step, the sound catching her breath. The customers turned their heads, drawn by the music's gentle insistence. The painter looked up, his eyes suddenly bright. "Play," he whispered. The violinist smiled and began a slow melody, something wistful, tender, perhaps improvised. The notes drifted through the bakery like perfume, weaving between the tables and cups. Even the cat lifted its head, ears twitching. Marcel leaned against the counter, eyes half closed. The song carried him back to another autumn, decades ago, when he had danced in this very room during a celebration of peace. His wife had worn a blue dress that caught the light like silk water. The memory rose unbidden, bittersweet but gentle. When the last note faded, the customers applauded softly, reluctant to break the spell. The violinist bowed slightly. "Payment enough," he said. Colette brought him a pastry anyway. "Art deserves dessert," she said. He laughed. "Then may your kindness always stay out of tune." The painter grinned at that, and the three of them shared a look that felt like friendship's beginning. Marcel, watching from the counter, thought how strange and wonderful it was, the way strangers could find one another, through a bit of music, through bread, through the simple accident of sheltering from rain. Henri returned from the kitchen, wiping his hands. "You'll spoil them," he told Marcel quietly. "If they stay too long, they'll forget the rest of the city exists." Marcel smiled. "Let them. The city will wait." As the afternoon deepened, the painter began a new sketch, this time of the violinist mid-song, Colette leaning on the counter beside him, the warm glow reflected in their faces. Every few strokes, he paused to study the rain, as if needing its rhythm to guide his pencil. When Colette brought him a refill of coffee, she noticed his croissant untouched. "You haven't eaten a bite," she said. He shrugged. "I'm feeding something else." "Then I'll warm it up," she said, whisking the plate away before he could protest. The violinist chuckled. "You'll learn not to argue with her." "Too late," the painter said, smiling. The laughter drew a few others in. Conversations resumed. Plates clinked. The radio hummed faintly again. The brief concert had turned the bakery into something even softer. A place where time bent a little, where strangers spoke like old friends. Outside, the clouds began to lighten at their edges. A silver thread of sky appeared through the parting mist. The rain slowed, but did not stop, tapping gently now, as if exhausted from its own beauty. Marcel stood near the window, hands folded behind his back. He looked at the faces reflected in the glass, each one calm, content, unaware that they had become part of a small living painting. He thought of how fragile these moments were, how easily they slipped away once the sun returned. Yet for now, it was enough. The church bell rang, once from across the river. The violinist began packing his instrument. The painter closed his book with a satisfied sigh. Colette passed by, collecting empty cups. "Leaving already?" she asked. "I'll be back tomorrow," the painter said. "The light will be different, and so will we." She smiled. I'll keep your corner ready. When the door closed behind him, the bell gave its familiar chime, followed by the low murmur of the rain. The violinist lingered for a few moments more, then bowed his head and stepped out into the grey. Henri looked at Marcel. Quiet again, he said. Yes, Marcel replied. But the quiet's fuller now, and as the baker turned to the oven, the flame reflected briefly in his eyes, a steady golden light against the cool silver of the rain outside. By early afternoon, the bustle of the morning had eased into a calm hum. The tables were half empty now. Most customers had gone back to their errands, their umbrellas reopening like wings as they stepped into the street. A faint lull settled over the bakery, the kind of silence that wasn't truly empty, but filled with soft, lingering echoes, chairs scraping gently, a spoon against porcelain, the fading laughter of strangers. Henri stood by the long wooden table near the oven, sleeves rolled up, hands buried in dough. The movement was steady, rhythmic, push, fold, turn. The surface of the dough glistened faintly under the soft yellow light. Flour dusted his forearms, his cheek, even the edge of his dark hair. He didn't notice. The world for him, in that moment, consisted only of warmth, texture, and rhythm. Marcel watched him from across the room, leaning on the counter with a quiet smile. Henri's way with the dough reminded him of a craftsman at prayer, simple, deliberate, full of purpose. There was a patience in the young man that most of the world had long forgotten. Not too soft, Marcel said after a while. It should push back just a little. Henri nodded, pressing his palms again into the dough. Like life, he murmured. It resists, but that's what shapes it. Marcel chuckled. You're learning more from bread than I ever did from school. That's because bread listens, Henri replied, smiling faintly. The oven door creaked open, releasing a cloud of fragrant steam. Marcel checked the rising loaves inside, adjusting the heat with practiced ease. The fire glowed orange, its light dancing across the walls. Outside, rain continued its steady whisper. In the front room, Colette was wiping tables, humming softly. Occasionally she'd glance toward the street, where people hurried past with their collars turned up. A painter's sketch still lay on the counter, the gift he'd left behind for Marcel. She picked it up carefully, studying it under the lamplight. He had captured everything. The gleam of the counter, the cat asleep by the stove, even the tiny crack in the window pane near the door. It was all there, more beautiful than real life. You should frame it, she said to Marcel. He looked up from the oven. And remind everyone that even bread can be immortalized. Why not, she said. It deserves to be. He smiled. Maybe after closing. For now, let it breathe with the rest of us. Henri brushed the flour from his hands and began preparing the next batch of dough. The smell of yeast and salt mixed with the lingering sweetness of apple tarts. The radio crackled faintly, catching the middle of a slow waltz. Marcel adjusted the volume until the melody floated just above the rain. They worked like that for a while, each movement measured, each sound familiar. The bakery was their shared heartbeat, pulsing gently beneath the city's grey skin. A soft knock interrupted the quiet. Marcel looked up, surprised. The door opened, and a young delivery boy peeked inside, soaked from head to toe. Message for you, monsieur, he said, holding out a second envelope. Marcel wiped his hands and took it. The handwriting was different this time, smaller, neater, but again, there was no return address. He frowned slightly, Another letter? Colette asked. He nodded. Perhaps the first one was lonely. Are you going to open it? Not yet, he said. The bread's at a delicate point. Henri raised an eyebrow. You always say that. Marcel didn't answer. He placed the envelope beside the first, aligning their edges perfectly. Something about them, two silent visitors on the counter, made the bakery feel even quieter. When the boy had gone, Henri returned to kneading. The dough responded beneath his hands, pliant and smooth. He hummed a few bars of the waltz from the radio. You think they're from the same person? He asked. Could be, Marcel said. Could be life's way of keeping me from getting bored. Colette leaned on the counter, eyes twinkling. Or maybe from someone who remembers you fondly. Marcel smiled without looking up. At my age, fond memories arrive by post, because the people don't walk as far anymore. She laughed, but there was tenderness behind the sound. The door opened again, this time letting in a gust of cold air. A man in a long grey coat stepped inside, his hat dripping rain. He glanced around, uncertain. Are you still serving? He asked. Always, said Colette, moving toward him. Please sit anywhere. He nodded, removing his hat. His eyes lingered on the counter where the envelopes lay, then drifted to Marcel. Something flickered there, recognition perhaps, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Marcel greeted him with a polite nod. What will it be, monsieur? Coffee, the man said softly, black. As Colette poured the cup, Marcel returned to the oven. Henri slid another tray in beside him. The man sipped his coffee in silence, his gaze resting on the old photographs that lined the wall. He seemed lost in thought, as if each picture unlocked a door he wasn't sure he wanted to open. When Colette refilled his cup, he looked up. You've been here a long time, he said. Marcel nodded. Nearly 30 years. The man's smile was thin. That kind of constancy is rare. So is rain without end, Marcel replied. Yet here we are. They shared a small, knowing glance. The moment felt suspended. Two strangers measuring the years between words. Henri broke the silence by lifting the fresh loaves from the oven. The croissants crackled as they cooled, releasing the faintest sigh. The sound drew a few smiles from the customers, still lingering at their tables. Marcel brushed flour from his apron and placed a loaf on the counter. Fresh, he said to the man. It helps with thinking. The man hesitated, then accepted a slice. He took a bite, closed his eyes, and for a heartbeat his face softened, something like memory passing through him. It tastes the same, he murmured. The same as what? Colette asked. But he didn't answer. He finished his coffee, left a few coins, and stood. Thank you, he said to Marcel quietly, for keeping this place alive. Before Marcel could reply, he was gone, swallowed by the rain. Henri watched through the window. He looked familiar, he said. Many faces do, Marcel replied, though his expression said otherwise. The bakery settled again into its rhythm, the scrape of knives, the hum of the radio, the endless whisper of the rain. Colette hummed as she arranged pastries for the afternoon rush. Henri began sweeping flour into small white clouds that rose and fell with every motion. Marcel finally sat at the corner table, the two envelopes before him. He traced their edges with his finger, but did not open them. The rain had grown heavier again, beating against the glass like quiet applause. Tomorrow, he murmured. Tomorrow, perhaps. Outside, The sky darkened to pewter. The smell of fresh bread wrapped the room in a kind of peace that could only exist on days when the world seemed determined to stay indoors. And as the clock ticked toward 3, Henri began another batch, humming softly to himself, each movement deliberate and calm, his quiet task carrying the day forward, steady as the rain. By mid-afternoon, the light in the bakery had turned honey-coloured, soft and thick, like syrup poured over bread. The rain hadn't stopped. It rarely did, but it had grown quieter, finer, so that each drop felt like a whisper against the window panes. Marcel liked this hour best, the lull between the morning rush and the evening warmth. It was when the world outside slowed enough to let the heart listen. Henri was still at the back table, shaping rolls with methodical precision. Colette had tied her hair up again and was refilling sugar bowls, humming the same tune she had that morning. The cat had moved from the stove to the windowsill, its grey fur glowing faintly in the dim light. All was steady, peaceful, until the bell above the door rang, sharp against the hush. A soldier stepped in. He was young, perhaps no more than 25, though the weariness in his eyes made him seem older. His uniform was dark with rain, boots streaked with mud, cap tucked neatly under one arm. His hands trembled slightly, not from cold, but from something quieter, more internal. Marcel noticed the detail, but said nothing. Instead, he smiled, the way one does to a traveller finally home. "Come in, monsieur," he said. "You look like you've walked through all of Paris." The soldier gave a tired grin. "Nearly. The trains were delayed. I thought I'd wait out the rain somewhere that smelled better than the station." "Then you've chosen wisely." Marcel gestured to the seat nearest the stove. "Sit, warm yourself." The young man hesitated. "I might ruin your chair. That chair has survived worse stories than yours. I promise." He laughed softly and sat down, the sound of wet fabric pressing against wood. Colette appeared with a towel and a pot of coffee. "You'll want this," she said, pouring before he could reply. "It's strong enough to wake the sane." The soldier thanked her and took a sip. His shoulders dropped, his eyes closing briefly as the warmth spread through him. "You're right," he said. "That's life itself." Marcel returned behind the counter, slicing a fresh loaf. The crust cracked under his knife. "You've just come back from the south?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. The uniform told him everything. The mud, the insignia, the exhaustion that never quite washed away. 2 weeks on the road, the soldier said. No trains running properly since the floods. Feels like the whole country is still drying out. Paris always stays damp, Marcel said, smiling. It keeps her humble. The soldier laughed. A real laugh this time. "You sound like my grandfather. He used to say the rain is Paris's way of forgiving herself." "Smart man," Marcel replied. "Did he bake?" "He grew vineyards." "Close enough." Colette brought a plate of bread and cheese, setting it before the soldier. "On the house," she said. He shook his head. "I can't." "You can," she said firmly. "And you will." Marcel hid his smile behind the coffee pot. The soldier ate slowly, savouring each bite, eyes wandering to the photographs on the wall. "This place has been here a long time," he said between mouthfuls. "Since before the First War," Marcel said, "and it will likely outlive the next." The young man nodded. "My father used to talk about a bakery like this. Said he'd come here once as a boy. There was a man behind the counter who gave him a loaf for free when he'd lost his coin." Marcel's hand paused mid-motion. knife hovering over a fresh baguette. And did your father ever tell you that man's name? The soldier smiled faintly. He couldn't remember, but he said the bread was the best he'd ever had. Colette's eyes flicked toward Marcel, but he said nothing. He finished cutting the loaf and wrapped it neatly. You'll take this with you when you go, he said, voice steady, for the road. The soldier blinked. I can't take your bread too. It's not mine, Marcel said. It belongs to anyone who's still walking. Outside, the rain thickened again. The tram bell rang faintly in the distance, echoing between buildings. Henri carried a new tray of rolls to the counter and looked toward the soldier. Another cup? He asked. The soldier hesitated, then nodded. Please. It's been a long while since I've sat somewhere that felt safe. You're safe here, Henri said simply, pouring. The cat stretched on the sill, tail flicking lazily. The stove crackled, and for a long while, no one spoke. The silence wasn't heavy. It was shared, like bread passed from one hand to another. Finally, the soldier reached into his coat and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, then at Marcel. Can I leave this here? He asked. Marcel frowned slightly. A note? More or less, he said. A name, an address, someone I promised to find. But if she still lives near here, she'll come for bread eventually. Everyone does. Marcel took the paper carefully and slipped it beneath the counter. I'll keep it safe, he said. The soldier stood, brushing crumbs from his uniform. Colette handed him the wrapped loaf. For the road, she said softly. He took it with both hands, as if it was something sacred. Thank you, he said, voice quiet but full. Marcel nodded once. Travel well, soldier. Paris will wait for you. The man hesitated at the door, eyes scanning the room one last time. The golden light, the smell of coffee, the faint music still playing from the radio. Then he stepped out into the rain. The bell chimed softly behind him, and the door closed. Colette watched through the glass as he disappeared down the street. They all do, Marcel replied. But the lonely carry stories. They'll come back when they need to tell them. Henri turned off the oven flame and leaned against the counter. Do you think he'll find the person he's looking for? Marcel folded his arms. If he keeps walking, maybe. If not, the letter will wait for her, same as these walls have waited for us. The rain drummed harder on the awning, a rhythmic applause that filled the silence. Colette turned the radio slightly louder. A slow chanson began to play, melancholy but warm. She swayed a little as she worked, her movements matching the music. Henri smiled. You'll wear holes in the floor, he said. Better than in my heart, she replied. Marcel looked toward the counter, where the soldier's note lay beneath the 2 unopened envelopes. 3 now, side by side, like chapters of a story that hadn't yet found its ending. He brushed a bit of flour from his hands and exhaled. The smell of bread mingled with rain, coffee, and the faint scent of old wood. The afternoon light flickered against the glass, turning the bakery into a small world suspended in gold. And as the church bell marked 4, Marcel felt, for the first time in many years, that something was quietly moving toward him. Something from the past, soft-footed and patient, like the rain itself returning to where it began. The rain outside was heavier now, but it no longer sounded cold. It fell with a certain rhythm, like a lullaby meant for the weary. The afternoon had folded itself neatly into calm. The bakery breathed like a living creature, steady, content, warm. The clock above the counter ticked softly, the hands edging toward 5. Inside, the tables gleamed under the low light of the lamps. The air smelled of vanilla, roasted coffee, and something faintly citrus from the lemon tarts cooling near the window. Colette wiped the counter in slow, even circles, while humming a tune that seemed to echo the rain's gentle cadence. Henri was sweeping flour into neat piles, though most of it ended up on his shoes. Marcel watched them both, his hands folded over his apron. There was peace in the routine. He often thought the bakery's true secret ingredient wasn't butter or yeast, but patience, the quiet, unspoken kind that came from doing small things well. "Henri," he said after a moment, "take that basket to Madame Roux next door. She hasn't come in for 2 days." Henri looked up. "The widow with the canary?" "Yes." "Bring her a loaf and 2 tarts. Tell her it's for the bird if she argues." Henri grinned, wiping his hands on his apron. "And if the bird refuses, then we'll have to eat them ourselves." Colette giggled softly. "You're too kind, monsieur. One day you'll give away the whole bakery, then it will finally earn its keep," Marcel replied. Henri pulled on his coat, wrapped the basket in paper, and slipped out into the rain. The bell chimed faintly behind him, leaving a hush that felt both full and fragile. Colette leaned against the counter, watching the raindrops chase each other down the glass. "He'll get soaked," she said. "He'll dry," Marcel answered. "It's good for him to remember the world beyond this room." She turned back toward the tables, gathering cups and plates left by the last customers. A folded newspaper lay beside one saucer. She glanced at the headline, "Politics, another speech, promises of reconstruction." She sighed and tucked it under her arm. "Sometimes it feels like Paris is learning to breathe again," she said quietly. Marcel nodded. "And sometimes like she's afraid to." For a few minutes, they worked in companionable silence. The radio crackled, then caught a clear signal, a soft piano tune, slow and tender. It filled the space like candlelight. Then, as if drawn by the sound, the door opened once more. A man in a thick brown coat stepped inside, carrying a violin case. Marcel recognized him at once, the same musician who had played earlier that day. "Back again," Colette said, surprised. "I forgot my gloves," he replied, holding up empty hands. "But perhaps I also forgot the warmth. The warmth remembers you," Marcel said. "Sit." The musician smiled and took a seat by the window. His coat dripped faintly onto the tile, but he didn't seem to notice. Colette brought him a towel and a cup of tea without being asked. "You didn't have to," he said. She shrugged. "You played for us. This is the encore." He chuckled and accepted it. "Then I should tune my gratitude." The three of them shared a quiet laugh, and once again the bakery felt brighter. It always amazed Marcel how quickly kindness could change the air, how one small gesture could make a room breathe differently. A few moments later, Henri returned, his coat soaked through, but his smile intact. "Madame Roux sends her thanks," he said, setting down the empty basket, "and a warning that the canary prefers cherry next time." Marcel laughed. "We'll take it under advisement." Henri hung his coat by the stove, where steam began to rise from it. Almost immediately, the cat sniffed at the damp fabric then settled back onto its cushion, unimpressed by human errands. The musician finished his tea and placed a few coins on the counter. "Thank you again," he said. Marcel waved it away.
"Next time, bring the gloves and the song."
The man nodded and left, vanishing into the rain like a note carried off by wind. Evening light seeped slowly through the windows, the colour of diluted gold. The bakery had entered its quietest hour. That small stretch of time between the last customers and the first signs of night. Colette began wiping down the tables once more, her motions slower now, almost meditative. Henri restocked the bread shelves, humming the same waltz from the radio. Marcel took a moment to look around. Everything glowed softly, the glass jars of sugar, the polished brass handles, the flickering reflection of the street lamps on wet glass. This place, he thought, had grown into something larger than him. It held traces of every person who had passed through, the laughter, the confessions, even the silences. It was a living memory, stitched together with crumbs and conversation. The bell over the door rang again, this time with a lighter sound. A small boy peeked in, drenched from head to toe, his hair plastered against his forehead. Behind him, a woman, his mother perhaps, waited at the curb, waving him forward. "Excuse me, monsieur," the boy said. "Mama says we forgot to pay for the brioche this morning." Marcel knelt, so his eyes met the child's. "Then you must take another one, or it will be unbalanced." The boy blinked. "But, no arguing," Colette said, handing him a paper-wrapped loaf. "You'll make the rain jealous with that smell." He grinned, clutching it tight before running back into the storm. His mother mouthed mercy from the street. When the door closed, Colette sighed. "Small axe, big ripples," she said. Marcel nodded. That's how peace is baked. The clock struck 5. The rain softened again. Turning from drumming to whispering, Henri leaned on his broom, looking content. "Think anyone else will come?" "Someone always does," Marcel replied. "Rain invites reflection, and reflection brings company." He glanced at the counter where the 3 envelopes still waited. One from the morning, one from midday, one from the soldier. Their corners were slightly curled, their paper faintly damp from the humid air. They looked like old companions, waiting for a story to be told. Colette noticed his gaze. "You really won't open them?" "Not today," he said. "Today is for listening." She tilted her head. "To what?" "To the sound of gratitude." The room fell quiet again, save for the steady rhythm of rain and the faint hum of the oven. The scent of fresh bread thickened the air, sweet and familiar. Marcel poured 3 small cups of coffee and handed them to his companions. "To the kindness we forget we give," he said. "To the kindness that returns." Colette replied. Henri lifted his cup. "And to the rain that keeps us honest." They drank in silence, smiling faintly, each lost in thought. Outside, the sky dimmed to charcoal, the street lamps flickering to life one by one, and as the bell above the door swayed gently in the draught, it rang just once, soft, hesitant, like the echo of all the kindness that had passed through that little bakery on a rainy autumn day. Evening had begun its quiet descent over Paris. The clouds hung low, heavy with unshed rain, and the bakery glowed brighter against the dimming streets. The lamps inside burned softly, golden halos trembling with each flicker of the oven's flame. Outside, puddles mirrored the first lights of the cafes across the way, their reflections trembling as footsteps splashed through them. Inside, time slowed. The last customers of the afternoon had gone. The tables were empty now, except for a few forgotten crumbs and one folded newspaper, damp at the edges. The cat had returned to its favourite spot by the stove, purring as it drifted towards sleep. Colette and Henri moved quietly through the room, cleaning, preparing, not yet ready to close. Marcel stood behind the counter, drying his hands on his apron. The 3 envelopes lay exactly where he had left them, their edges slightly curled, the ink on the oldest one beginning to blur at the corners. They had sat there all day, like silent guests, patient and expectant. He reached out and ran a finger along their seams. The paper felt cool beneath his skin, almost alive. Colette noticed. "You're thinking about opening them," she said, voice light but curious. "Thinking," he replied, "isn't the same as acting." "True," she said, "but sometimes thinking too long is another way of hiding." Marcel smiled at that. "And sometimes patience is a kind of courage." Henri looked up from sweeping the floor.
"You've got an answer for everything, monsieur."
"Only when I've had enough coffee," Marcel said, pouring himself another small cup. The clock on the wall ticked towards 6. The rhythm of the rain shifted again, turning softer, gentler. Somewhere down the street, a musician was playing an accordion. The notes floated faintly through the damp air, curling around the edges of the open window. The melody carried a strange comfort, melancholy, yes, but familiar, like something the city itself was humming to remind its people that all endings are temporary. Colette leaned her elbows on the counter, resting her chin in her hands. "Who do you think sent them?" Marcel didn't answer right away. He turned the first envelope over, examining the handwriting. It was looping, elegant, written in ink that had slightly faded to sepia. The second was neater, careful, as if written by someone who had practiced their words before committing them to paper. The third, the one the soldier had brought, was simpler, younger somehow, the letters upright and straightforward. 3 different hands, Marcel said finally, but maybe one story. Henri frowned. Or 3, Marcel agreed. But stories like to meet each other eventually. They're like people that way. Colette smiled. "So which one will you let speak first?" Marcel considered this, his fingers tracing the edge of the oldest envelope. "The one that's waited longest," he said quietly. Henri stopped sweeping. "You're really going to open it?" "Yes," Marcel said. "Before I lose my nerve or my eyesight." He reached for the letter opener, kept beside the register, an old brass tool shaped like a feather. He slit the edge of the envelope carefully, as though afraid the paper might sigh. The smell of dust and time escaped as he unfolded the sheet inside. The handwriting was steady, unmistakably familiar, and for a moment he forgot how to breathe. Colette waited, watching him. "Monsieur," he read in silence, lips moving slightly, though no sound came. His expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. When he finally looked up, he seemed both older and lighter, as though a weight had shifted but not vanished. "It's from Claire," he said. His voice was calm, almost too calm. Henri exchanged a glance with Colette. "Claire? My wife," Marcel said softly. "She wrote this 30 years ago." Colette frowned. "But how could it only arrive now?" Marcel folded the letter carefully, setting it down as if it were made of glass. "It must have been lost, or perhaps someone kept it safe until the world was ready for me to read it." "What does it say?" Henri asked gently. Marcel hesitated, then shook his head. Some words are meant only to be heard in silence. The rain deepened outside, each drop striking the awning like a heartbeat. Colette said nothing more. She returned to wiping the counter, her movements slower now. Henri resumed sweeping, though his broom made no sound against the floorboards. The letter sat between them all, quiet but powerful, like a flame no one dared to blow out. After a while, Marcel poured himself another small cup of coffee and leaned against the counter. "She wrote this the day before I went away," he said at last, his voice low. "She said the bakery would keep me company when she couldn't, and that as long as I kept baking, she'd find her way back to me, somehow." Colette's eyes softened. "That's beautiful. It's a promise," Marcel said, "and promises, like bread, take time to rise." The clock ticked once, twice. Somewhere in the back, the oven gave a soft sigh as its flame shifted. The smell of warm crust filled the air again. Henri cleared his throat. "And the other letters?" Marcel looked at the remaining two. The second one, the one from the delivery boy, seemed almost to glow in the lamplight, as if waiting its turn, but Marcel didn't touch it. Not yet. "One thing at a time," he said. "The heart can only reopen so fast." They worked in silence for a few more minutes, the rhythm of their movements falling in sync with the rain outside. Colette began setting out fresh plates for the evening rush, though she knew few would come. Henri checked the ovens, whistling softly under his breath. When he returned to the front, he found Marcel still standing there. The letter unfolded before him again. He wasn't reading it this time, just looking at it, as though memorizing the handwriting, tracing the shape of the words with his eyes. Henri didn't speak. Instead, he set a cup of tea beside him and turned down the lamps a little. The light dimmed, softening the edges of everything. Colette came to stand beside them. Together they looked out through the window. The street beyond was a watercolor of grey and gold. A man hurried past with his coat collar raised, and behind him, two children splashed through puddles, laughing. "It's funny," Colette said quietly. "The rain hides so much, but it also brings things back." Marcel nodded. "Yes, it brings letters and memories, and sometimes, if we're patient, it brings people too." He folded the letter one last time, sliding it back into its envelope. Then he placed it carefully on the shelf behind the counter, next to a small framed photograph. A woman smiling beside a tray of pastries, the bakery's door wide open behind her. The clock struck 6:30. The bell above the door stirred with the draft, ringing once, though no one entered. The sound lingered in the air, thin and wistful. Marcel looked at the remaining two envelopes, then back at the photograph. "Tomorrow," he said quietly. "The rest can wait until tomorrow." Outside, the rain fell steady and sure, washing the city clean of dust and hurry. Inside, the bakery glowed warm against the twilight, a pocket of stillness in a restless world, and somewhere between the smell of coffee and the whisper of the rain, a faint sense of promise hovered, like the moment before dawn or the heartbeat before reunion. When the rain finally paused, it didn't stop so much as hesitate. The downpour slowed to a fine mist, thin enough for the city to catch its breath. The air outside shimmered with faint light. Street lamps reflected in puddles, their glow trembling like candle flames. Through the bakery windows, Paris seemed softer, half hidden in its own reflection. Inside, the world held still. The sound of dripping water replaced the steady drumming that had filled the day. The awning sagged slightly under the weight of droplets that now fell in slower rhythms. A tram bell rang in the distance, faint and far between. Marcel stood near the door, one hand resting on the frame, watching the quiet unfold. He had lived through many rains, but there was something about this one that felt personal. Perhaps it was the letter tucked behind the counter, or perhaps the way the city seemed to wait with him, as though both were remembering something. Behind him, Colette stacked clean plates, her movements unhurried. Henri swept the floor, his broom whispering across the boards. The radio had gone silent. Its signal had faded into static an hour earlier. No one had bothered to fix it. The hush felt too sacred to disturb. Colette looked up from her work. "It stopped," she said softly, as if saying it too loudly might make the clouds change their mind. "For now," Marcel answered. "Paris only ever pauses. It never stops." Henri set his broom aside and leaned against the counter. "Feels strange," he said, "like when music ends, but your ears keep hearing it." "That's because the quiet is never really empty," Marcel said. "It's just full of things we haven't noticed yet." Colette smiled faintly. "You talk like a poet today." He chuckled. "Only because the rain rewrites my thoughts before I can speak them." She glanced toward the counter, where the remaining 2 envelopes lay side by side, untouched. "You think one of those might tell you what to say next?" "Maybe," he said. "Or maybe they'll tell me to keep listening." Henri poured himself a small cup of coffee and another for Marcel. He handed it over, steam curling between them. "You haven't eaten since noon," he said. "I'll eat when I'm hungry." "You never are," Colette teased. Marcel took a sip and set the cup down. "Bakers forget hunger. We spend all day feeding others." The cat stirred near the window, stretching lazily before hopping down to inspect a crumb beneath one of the tables. Its paws left faint flower prints as it padded away. The sight made Colette laugh softly. "Even he's restless now." Henri glanced toward the street. "Maybe the rain's pause means something. Maybe it's waiting for us to do something before it starts again." "Then we'd better do it quickly," Colette said. Marcel turned from the door, his reflection merging with the glow of the street outside. "Maybe," he said, "it's waiting for someone." A faint wind stirred the curtain beside the door. The smell of wet stone and smoke drifted in. Somewhere in the distance, church bells began to ring. The evening call, 7 slow tones that rolled across the rooftops. Each chime seemed to press deeper into the air. Colette walked to the window, wiping a clear circle into the glass. "Look," she whispered. Across the street, the flower vendor was closing her stall, wrapping the remaining chrysanthemums in paper. A couple strolled past, their shoes splashing gently. A man with a small dog stopped to shake the rain from his hat. The city, for all its noise, moved tenderly in moments like this. "It's beautiful," Colette said. Marcel nodded. "Everything looks kinder after rain." Henri checked the clock. "We should start the next batch before closing." "Let it wait," Marcel said. "Let the ovens rest. They've earned it." He moved toward the counter, brushing flour dust from his hands. His gaze lingered again on the 2 unopened letters. The second one, the one from the delivery boy, still looked crisp, unbothered by the day's humidity. He reached for it almost unconsciously. Colette noticed. Now seems as good a pause as any. He opened the letter carefully, sliding a finger beneath the seal. The paper unfolded easily. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, not rushed. Marcel adjusted his glasses and began to read. His expression shifted only slightly, a tightening of the jaw, a faint tremor in his hand. "What does it say?" Colette asked. He didn't answer right away. His eyes moved slowly down the page, lingering at the end. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. "It's from Henri's brother." Henri froze. "My brother?" Marcel nodded. "It's dated 2 years ago. The letter must have gone astray." Henri stepped forward, eyes wide.
He was in there. I haven't heard from him since the floods."
Marcel handed it to him gently. "Then he's found his way back to you." Henri unfolded the page, his lips parting as he read. Colette stepped closer but didn't speak. His eyes moved fast, then slower, then stopped altogether. For a moment, he simply stood there, shoulders rising and falling. "He's all right," Henri said finally, his voice trembling. "He's in the south, working at a vineyard. He says he thought of me every time it rained." Colette placed a hand on his arm. "Then the rain was never really against you?" Henri laughed softly, the sound half choked, half joyful. "He says he'll visit before winter. Then we'll save him a loaf," Marcel said. Henri folded the letter carefully, pressing his palm over it, as though to steady something inside himself.
"Merci, monsieur."
Marcel nodded. "Don't thank me. Thank the postman who believed in lost things." The room grew still again. Even the rain seemed to hold its breath outside. Henri tucked the letter into his apron pocket and returned to his place near the oven. His movements were slower now, but lighter somehow, as if the day had lifted its weight from his shoulders. Colette watched him for a moment, before turning back to Marcel. "You see," she said, "the rain always brings something good when it pauses." Marcel smiled faintly. "Perhaps it does, or perhaps it just waits long enough for us to notice what's already here." The cat leapt back onto the windowsill, curling into a grey circle. Outside, a thin ribbon of light broke through the clouds, streaking gold across the rooftops. The city glowed as if exhaling after holding itself too long. Colette set 3 cups of tea on the counter. "For luck," she said. Marcel raised his cup. "For letters that find their way." Henri lifted his own. "And for pauses that make us listen." The clock chimed again. 7:30 now. The ovens ticked softly as they cooled. The rain still hovered at the edge of the clouds, waiting for its cue to return. And in that suspended moment, the bakery held more than warmth. It held reunion, quiet gratitude, and the fragile beauty of things that come back when we least expect them. Night began to fall gently over Paris. Though the city's heartbeat still pulsed beneath the mist, the lamps along Rue de la Madeleine had bloomed into halos of gold, their reflections rippling across the wet stones. Inside the bakery, the air was dense with warmth, the last trays of bread cooling on the racks, the scent of sugar and butter clinging to every beam of wood. Marcel adjusted the wick on one of the lamps, softening its glow. The rain had returned, but now it was a light drizzle, a mere whisper compared to the day's earlier storm. Colette was stacking cups by the sink, humming under her breath. Henri, still smiling faintly from his brother's letter, swept the floor for what must have been the 5th time. The bell above the door rang, and the hush of rain followed it in. The woman stepped inside, holding the hand of a small boy. They were soaked through, their coats darkened by the drizzle, but their faces carried that particular brightness of people who had been walking in laughter. The child's hair clung to his forehead, a few strands catching the lamplight like threads of gold. Bonsoir, Marcel said, setting down the towel he had been using. You're brave to be out in this weather. The woman smiled apologetically. We missed the tram. He insisted on walking instead. The boy grinned up at her, unrepentant. I wanted to hear the rain sing. Marcel chuckled. Then you found the right place. The rain always sounds better with something sweet. Colette appeared from behind the counter, drying her hands. Cocoa? She asked, already reaching for the pot. Yes, please, the woman said. One for him and one for me. Henri pulled out 2 chairs near the stove. The child climbed into his with a little bounce, leaving wet footprints on the floor. His mother removed her gloves and unpinned her hat, shaking loose a few curls. Her coat steamed faintly in the warmth as Colette whisked the cocoa. The smell of chocolate and milk filled the air. The boy's eyes followed her every movement, as if the act itself were magic. Does everyone come here when it rains? He asked. Not everyone, Marcel said. Only the lucky ones. The boy giggled. Then I must be very lucky. You are, Colette said, setting a cup before him. This one has extra cream, for the rain singer. The boy leaned forward, inhaling the steam. It smells like a holiday. His mother smiled, watching him sip carefully. For a while, they said nothing, just sat, listening to the rain's soft percussion on the glass. The bakery seemed to exhale around them, settling into its evening rhythm. Henri returned to the counter, drying his hands. Looks like the rain will keep us company all night, he said. Good, Colette replied. It makes the bakery sound alive. Marcel poured himself a small cup of coffee and took a seat near the window. Through the fogged glass, he could just make out the faint outline of the Seine, dark and wide under the grey sky. When I was a boy, he said suddenly, I thought the rain spoke to everyone differently. To some it whispered. What does it say to you now? Colette asked. He smiled faintly. It reminds me to listen. The boy finished his cocoa, leaving a faint moustache of cream on his upper lip. Do you have any bread left? He asked eagerly. Plenty, Marcel said. But bread is for those who promise to behave. I promise, the boy said at once. Colette handed him a small brioche, still warm from the oven. He held it like treasure, tearing off a piece and offering it to his mother first. She accepted with a laugh, shaking her head. You see, he's learning good manners somewhere. Bread teaches everything worth knowing, Marcel said. Then he's a fine student, she replied. The boy looked around the bakery, eyes wide. Do you live here? He asked. Marcel chuckled. In a way, yes. The bakery doesn't sleep much, so someone has to stay awake with it. Do you ever get lonely? The question surprised him. He hesitated, then said, Sometimes, but the dough listens when I talk. The boy nodded seriously, as if that made perfect sense. Colette knelt beside his chair. And what do you do when you're lonely? I sing to the rain, he said, mouthful of brioche. Then it sings back. That's a good trick, Henri said. Can you teach it to us? The boy looked thoughtful. You just have to listen first. The rain gets shy. They all laughed, and for a moment the world felt impossibly gentle. Even the cat stirred, stretching before curling up again, as if to join the conversation in spirit. The woman finished her drink and stood. How much do we owe you? Marcel waved a hand. Nothing. You've already paid in music. She smiled, unsure whether to protest. then simply said, "Mercy, this is the kind of place one remembers." As they stepped out into the drizzle, the boy turned back at the door. "I'll come again," he said. "Next time it rains, we'll save you a chair," Colette replied. The bell chimed as the door closed behind them, and for a long moment no one spoke. The sound of their footsteps faded into the distance. Henri sighed contentedly. "I think he's right," he said. "The rain does sing." Marcel nodded, and the city hums along. The lamps flickered as the wind pressed against the windows. Colette gathered the empty cups, her movements slow, thoughtful. "He reminded me of someone," she said. "Perhaps yourself," Marcel said. "Before Paris made you sensible." She laughed. "Then I hope the city never finishes the job." Outside, the drizzle thickened again, returning to its steady rhythm. The light from the street lamps shimmered against the wet pavement, stretching into soft golden lines. Marcel looked toward the counter where the letters rested. Only one remained unopened, the one left by the soldier. He felt its weight even from across the room, as if it carried something heavier than words. Henri followed his gaze, but said nothing. Colette glanced between them, sensing the quiet shift in the air. "Not tonight," she whispered. "No," Marcel agreed. "Not yet." They returned to their closing tasks, each movement unhurried, wrapped in the kind of peace that can only exist after kindness has been exchanged. The smell of bread lingered like memory. The rain's lullaby continued outside, steady and unending, and somewhere down the street, faint but clear, came the sound of a child's laughter mingled with rain, proof that small acts of warmth could echo far beyond the walls that created them. The rain had quieted again by the time the clock struck 8. The sound was no longer sharp or insistent. It was the hush that comes after a day of speaking. The street outside shimmered, washed clean, the reflections of lamplight stretching like ribbons across the slick stones. Inside the bakery, the warmth held steady, golden and alive. Marcel stood at the back table, sleeves rolled, a bowl of dough before him. Colette was cleaning the counter, humming under her breath, and Henri was rearranging the shelves of freshly baked loaves. The air was rich with the scent of butter and sugar, of vanilla and faint citrus. It was the calm part of the evening, the one Marcel cherished most. The day's rush had ended, but the night's peace had not yet begun. It was a time for small tasks, for quiet thoughts, for the kind of reflection that crept in between movements. "Colette," Marcel said suddenly, "have you seen the spice jar?" She looked up. "Which one?" "The one for the autumn cakes. The blend with the nutmeg and clove." She frowned, scanning the shelves. "It should be on the second row." "It's not." He checked again, lifting jars and tins, peering into the corners. The familiar rhythm of his hands grew more hurried. "It's always here, always." Henri turned from the oven. "Maybe we used the last of it." "No," Marcel said firmly. "I remember refilling it last week." Colette tried to hide her smile. "Perhaps it's hiding." He gave her a mock glare. "Spices don't hide, mademoiselle. They simply forget to be found." "Like people," Henri muttered. Marcel didn't answer. He continued searching, opening drawers, shifting canisters, moving flour sacks. The air filled with the faint sound of glass and metal clinking together. The rhythm of the bakery changed subtly. Even the cat lifted its head, ears twitching at the unusual noise. Finally, Marcel stopped, resting his hands on the counter. "Gone," he said softly. After 20 years of standing in the same place, it's gone. Colette approached gently. We can make another blend. He shook his head. It won't be the same. That mix was my wife's recipe. She used to say that autumn needed its own perfume. The words hung in the warm air. Colette hesitated, unsure whether to speak. Maybe we can remember it together, she offered. You said it had nutmeg and clove. What else? Marcel stared at the empty space on the shelf. Cinnamon, of course. A pinch of orange peel. But there was something else. Something I can't recall. Cardamom? Henri suggested. Marcel shook his head. No. Too strong. Vanilla, Colette said. Too soft. He exhaled, rubbing his temples. It's strange. I can remember the smell exactly, but not the ingredient. Smells are like ghosts, Colette said quietly. They stay, even when the memory fades. He smiled faintly. Then this ghost is teasing me. Henri poured him a cup of coffee and slid it across the counter. Maybe it will come back when you stop looking. Marcel nodded slowly. Perhaps. He took a sip and leaned back against the table, eyes half closed. The steady rain outside filled the silence between them, soft and rhythmic. Colette wandered toward the spice rack, pulling jars from their places, opening each one to breathe in the scent. Cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, allspice, each familiar, yet none quite right. She lined them up on the counter like suspects. Let's think, she said. If it was your wife's recipe, what would she have added to surprise people? Marcel opened his eyes, thinking. She liked warmth more than sweetness. Maybe something earthy. Ginger? He paused. No. Wait. His expression shifted. Hope flickering like the flame in the oven. Black pepper. Henri blinked. Pepper in a cake? Marcel nodded. Slowly. Just a whisper of it, she said. It reminded the sugar not to fall asleep. Colette laughed. Then let's wake the sugar. Together they mixed the ingredients. Cinnamon, nutmeg, clove, orange peel, and a pinch of black pepper. The scent rose immediately, familiar yet sharper, like a memory turning its face toward the light. Marcel inhaled deeply. Yes, he whispered. That's it. Henri leaned closer. You sure? Marcel nodded. I could find her by this smell alone. Colette poured the mixture into a small bowl. Then the recipe isn't lost anymore. Not lost, Marcel said softly, just waiting for someone to remember. They worked together to prepare a small batch of the autumn cakes. The batter was thick and fragrant, dotted with bits of candied fruit. Marcel handled each step with quiet reverence, as if performing a ritual. Colette lined the pans with parchment, her movements careful and sure. Henri tended the oven, adjusting the flame with the precision of habit. As the cakes baked, the air filled with warmth, so rich it seemed to hum. The scent drifted through the open door, curling into the street, inviting the night to pause and listen. Passers-by slowed, glancing in through the fogged glass. One woman smiled, pressing her gloved hand to the window, as if to catch the smell. When the timer chimed, Marcel opened the oven door. A golden wave of scent rolled out, filling every corner of the bakery. He lifted one cake gently, slicing into it with a knife. The texture was perfect, tender but not soft, crumbly but not dry. He took a small bite and closed his eyes. The taste brought him back to the years when Claire had stood beside him, dusting flour from her hands, humming the same tune that Colette now hummed without knowing. For a moment, the air around him shimmered with memory. Her laughter, the sound of rain against the shutters, the warmth of two people building a world together out of sugar and faith. When he opened his eyes again, he found Colette and Henri watching him expectantly. "Well?" Colette asked. Marcel smiled, his voice quiet but steady. "It's perfect. The past remembered itself." Colette clapped softly. Henri grinned. "Then we should name it properly," he said. "The cake that forgot itself." Marcel chuckled. "No, the cake that remembered." They placed the cakes on a cooling rack, their golden tops glistening in the lamplight. Outside, the rain began again, soft but steady, like applause from the sky. Colette leaned against the counter, inhaling deeply. "It smells like something happy." Marcel nodded. "It smells like her." Henri looked toward the shelves. "You'll keep this recipe safe now?" Marcel smiled faintly. "I'll write it down tomorrow. Tonight I'll let it live in the air." The three of them stood there for a moment, letting the scent wrap around them, the warmth of the oven and the memory of love blending into something wordless. And when the clock struck 9, the first thunderless hush of true evening settled over the bakery, a calm so full it could have been mistaken for grace. The aroma of the autumn cakes lingered like a dream, winding through every corner of the bakery long after the last tray had been pulled from the oven. Outside, the rain had settled into a quiet rhythm again, tapping softly against the shutters. The city beyond seemed half asleep, the street lamps casting gentle halos over puddles that mirrored their golden light. Colette stood near the counter, arms folded, watching the steam curl from the cooling rack. "They're too perfect," she said suddenly. Marcel, seated by the window, raised an eyebrow. "Too perfect?" "Yes, they smell like memory itself. No one should be trusted with that much power." Henri chuckled from the corner, polishing a stack of glasses. "You mean they're good?" "I mean," she said, pretending to scowl, "they could make a person weep." Marcel smiled faintly. "Then they're doing their job." The three of them stood in companionable silence for a while, each listening to the rain and the soft ticking of the cooling cakes. The day had been long, but in its rhythm, its quiet patterns of work and laughter, there was something sacred. Marcel had always believed that peace was not the absence of noise, but the presence of gentleness. He rose from his chair, stretching his back. "We should make more before morning," he said. "This batch won't last an hour once the doors open." Colette frowned. "We don't have enough orange peel." Marcel blinked. "Of course we do." "No," she said, crossing to the pantry. "I used the last of it this afternoon." Henri sighed. That's what happens when improvisation smells like courage. Marcel scratched his chin, thinking, no orange peel means no brightness. The recipe will feel asleep again. Then we wake it up another way, Colette said. He watched her curiously. How? She looked around the shelves, her eyes narrowing with mischief. With what we have, not what we wish for. He folded his arms. That's a dangerous philosophy for baking. Only if you fear the unexpected, she said, pulling down a small tin. Ginger preserves. Henry's been hoarding them. Henri raised both hands in protest. For emergencies. This is an emergency, she said. Marcel chuckled. You're not wrong. She opened the tin, releasing a sharp, sweet fragrance that mingled with the warm spice, still floating in the air. It's bright, like the orange peel, but bolder, she said. What if we melt it into the syrup glaze? Marcel hesitated, then nodded slowly. Show me. The words carried weight. They were an invitation and a challenge in equal measure. Colette grinned and set to work. She measured the sugar, water, and preserves into a copper pan, stirring as the mixture began to shimmer, the air filled with the scent of candied heat, of something both new and familiar. Henri leaned over her shoulder. Smells risky, he murmured. Smells alive, she corrected. Marcel watched the two of them, his lips curving into a quiet smile. There was something satisfying in letting others take the reins, watching them find their own rhythm, their own courage. He remembered the first time Colette had walked into the bakery 2 years ago, barely 17, full of chatter and clumsy determination. She had burned her first batch of croissants, nearly dropped a tray of eclairs, and declared that her mistakes smelled like ambition. Now, as she stirred the pan with steady hands, Marcel saw what time and kindness had made of her. The glaze thickened, golden, and bubbling. Colette turned off the flame and dipped a spoon to test it. Taste, she said, holding it out to Henri. He took a small bite, wincing as the heat hit his tongue, then grinned. That's dangerous, he said, but in a good way. Marcel stepped forward, sampling a drop on his fingertip. The flavor burst bright and warm, the sweetness edged with a spark of ginger. Not my wife's recipe, he said quietly, but one she would have admired. Colette's eyes softened. Then we'll call it ours. They brushed the glaze over the new batch of cakes. The smell transformed the air again, sharper, livelier, a scent that seemed to stretch awake after a long rest. Outside, the rain resumed its patient tapping, as if keeping time with their movements. Henri opened the back door for a moment, to let the steam drift out. Cool air rushed in, carrying the scent of wet stone and leaves. The sound of distant laughter floated down the street, perhaps from the cafe across the square, where a jazz trio played softly behind fogged windows. Paris was alive again, but inside the bakery, the world remained small and golden. Colette dusted powdered sugar across the cakes, her fingers careful, her expression concentrated. Do you ever wonder, she said, how many people have stood right here, thinking their small act of care didn't matter? Marcel tilted his head. What makes you ask that? She shrugged.
It just feels like every loaf, every cup, every kindness, they all leave something behind. Maybe it's not the bread people remember, but the way they felt when they ate it.
Marcel smiled. Then we've done well today. People will remember feeling full. Henri nodded. Full of bread or full of something else. It's the same warmth either way. For a while, no one spoke. The rain continued its rhythm. The cakes cooled. The lamp flickered softly, its light trembling across the wooden floor. Then, without warning, the bell above the door rang. All three looked up. A gust of wind swept in, carrying the smell of rain and something faintly floral, like perfume, clinging to an old coat. In the doorway stood a man in a dark hat, his face half shadowed. He removed it slowly, eyes scanning the room. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Marcel's fingers tightened on the counter. Something in the man's posture, something in the quiet certainty of his gaze, pulled at an old thread inside him. Bonsoir, the man said. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it, a gravity that made the air seem to pause. You still make the bread with the crust that cracks like thunder. Marcel's breath caught. Sometimes, he said softly, when the weather is right. The man smiled faintly. Then tonight is perfect. Henri glanced at Colette, who looked between them with silent curiosity. She sensed a story rising in the room, like dough beneath a cloth. Marcel stepped out from behind the counter, his movements slow, deliberate.
You've come far, Kim.
The man nodded. Far enough to remember how warmth smells. The rain whispered harder against the glass, as if to underline the moment. Colette reached for a loaf, wrapping it gently in paper. Her hands trembled just enough to make the paper crackle. For him, she whispered. For him, Marcel said, and as she placed the bread in the man's waiting hands, something invisible passed between them. A thread of recognition, faint but unbreakable, stretching across 30 years and the length of a lifetime's waiting. Outside, thunder rumbled softly in the distance. Not loud, just enough to mark the turning of a page. The man held the loaf of bread for a long moment before speaking again. His hands were steady, but his gaze seemed to drift, as if measuring the years between memory and the present. The smell of warm crust filled the space between them, an invisible bridge built of flour and time. It hasn't changed, he said quietly, even after all these years. Marcel studied him, the flicker of the lamp catching the lines of his face. There was something hauntingly familiar in the shape of his eyes, in the way his left brow lifted slightly when he spoke. A memory stirred, hesitant but insistent, like a melody, half remembered from youth. You've been here before, Marcel said slowly. The man smiled faintly. Once, long ago. I was a boy then, too shy to come inside. I remember standing out there, in the rain, watching through the window as a woman dusted sugar over a tray of cakes. She looked up and waved. Marcel felt the breath catch in his throat. Claire, always waving to strangers as if they were family. He said nothing, only nodded. She gave me a loaf, the man continued. Said it was from the baker, for luck. I promised I'd return one day to thank him. And have you come to keep your promise? The man's smile deepened. It seems I have. Colette stood near the counter, silent, her gaze moving between them. Colette's neared on the broom, the faint scrape of its bristles against the floor, the only sound in the room. Outside, the rain had eased into mist again, a quiet veil over the city. Marcel gestured toward the nearest table. Sit, please. The bread tastes better with company. The man hesitated, then nodded. He set his hat on the chair beside him and took a seat. Colette brought a cup of coffee, without being asked, her steps careful. It's on the house, she said softly. Merci, he murmured. For a while, they sat in near silence. The clock ticked softly. The cat, sensing calm, returned to the stove and curled into a perfect circle. The man tore a small piece of bread and tasted it. His eyes closed briefly, just as I remembered. How is that possible? Because memory is a better preservative than salt, Marcel said. The man laughed quietly. Then you've been keeping memories fresh all this time. Someone has to, Marcel replied. Henri cleared his throat, sensing something deeper unfolding. Were you from Paris? The man nodded. I grew up on Rue de Sèvres, near the bookshop with the blue shutters. Marcel's eyes flickered. Ah, yes. The one that used to sell maps and novels together. You could buy your next journey and its story in the same visit. The man smiled. That's the one. My father was the printer there. Colette brightened. The printer? I remember my aunt talking about him. She said he could fix a press with a shoelace and a prayer. The man laughed. That sounds like him. As they spoke, something in Marcel's expression softened. Recognition blooming slowly. Your father's name? He asked carefully. Armand, the man said. Armand, Duval. The words landed like a small bell in the air. Marcel's shoulders straightened slightly. Then you must be Luc. The man's head lifted, surprised.
You remember?
I remember a boy who waited by the window, with a red scarf and a shy smile. Claire gave him a loaf because she said his eyes looked hungry for more than bread. Luc's expression faltered, emotions flickering like candlelight. She remembered me too. Then, of course, Marcel said gently. Claire remembered everyone. Silence filled the space between them again, not empty, but full of something almost holy. The sound of rain against the awning returned, steady and kind. Luc leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. I thought the bakery would be gone by now. So many things have changed. Not everything needs to, Marcel said. Luc looked around the room. The wooden beams, the glass jars, the familiar glow of the oven. You kept it the same, because people need places that stay, Marcel said simply. Colette, moved by the quiet weight of their exchange, began preparing another pot of coffee. Henri busied himself stacking trays, though his movements were slower, more deliberate. The bakery seemed to listen, every creak of wood and sigh of heat bearing witness. Luc glanced toward the counter, noticing the 2 envelopes resting there. Still receiving letters, I see, he said. Marcel's eyes followed his. Letters have a way of finding me, even when I'm not ready for them. Do you ever answer them? Only the ones written by silence. Luc nodded, as if understanding perfectly. Then perhaps I brought the right kind of message tonight. Marcel tilted his head. You brought bread, not paper. Luc smiled. The bread was just an excuse to come in. I have something else for you. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper, its edges worn but neatly kept. He placed it on the table between them. My father found this years ago, after the war, tucked inside an old book from his shop. He meant to return it, but he never got the chance. Marcel hesitated, then unfolded the paper. His breath caught. The handwriting was unmistakable. Claire's faded ink, but still legible. Just a few words, for whoever finds this. The scent of home is not a place, but a kindness that stays when we're gone. The world seemed to still. The lamps flickered once. Colette's hand paused mid-motion. Marcel read the words again, then looked at Luc. You carried this all these years. Luc nodded. I didn't know who it belonged to until I saw the sign tonight. The moment I smelled the bread, I knew. Marcel folded the paper carefully, reverently. Then it's home again. Luc smiled. It never left, monsieur. It was only waiting for the right evening. Outside, a gust of wind swept past, rattling the awning, scattering droplets against the glass. The rain began again, soft, persistent, but somehow gentler than before. Henri poured fresh cups for everyone. They drank in quiet companionship, the warmth of the bakery wrapping around them. When Luc finally rose to leave, he placed a few francs on the counter. Marcel pushed them back. You've already paid, my friend, he said. Luke hesitated at the door. How? With memory, Marcel replied. And return. The man smiled one last time, placing his hat on his head. Then I'll come back again, rain or not. You'll always find the light on, Marcel said. As the door closed behind him, the bell chimed softly. The sound lingered long after Luke had disappeared into the silver night. Colette exhaled. Who was he, really? Marcel looked down at the folded paper in his hands. A promise kept. The clock ticked toward 10. The rain's rhythm deepened once more, wrapping the bakery in its familiar heartbeat. And somewhere within the scent of bread and the hush of evening, it seemed that Claire's words floated still, reminding them all that kindness once given never truly leaves. By the time Luke's footsteps had faded into the rain, night had fully claimed the city. The sky outside was a dark velvet, scattered with faint reflections of lamps and window light. The rain had eased again into a drizzle, soft enough to hear each drop's small applause against the awning. Inside, the bakery glowed warmly, every corner touched by amber light. The ovens were off now, their heat lingering in the air like the final breath of a song. The smell of baked sugar and cooling bread mixed with the faint scent of damp wool from their coats hung by the door. Colette leaned her elbows on the counter, her chin resting in her hands. It's been a strange day, she said softly. Henri, still by the oven, nodded. Strange, but good. The kind that makes you think the world has been holding its breath, and finally remembered to exhale. Marcel smiled faintly from his chair by the window. Paris does that sometimes. She hides her miracles in rain. Colette turned toward him. Do you think we've seen the last of them for tonight? He hesitated, listening. Beyond the soft patter of rain, there was the distant hum of a tram, the muffled laughter of people closing umbrellas, the occasional bark of a dog. No, he said. There's always one more story before closing. As if summoned by his words, the bell above the door rang gently. All three looked up. 2 figures entered. An elderly couple, arm in arm. The man wore a flat cap and a coat that looked far too large for him. The woman's shawl shimmered faintly with rain. They paused by the door, blinking in the light, their faces soft with fatigue, but also with that quiet affection only years could shape. Bonsoir, Colette said, straightening. You're welcome to sit. Please come in. Merci, my dear, the woman said, her voice trembling slightly with age. We were walking home from the river when the rain decided we were too dry. Henri hurried forward with a towel. Sit by the stove. It's warmer there. The couple thanked him and took their seats near the fire. The woman sighed contentedly, removing her gloves. It smells heavenly in here. Butter and rain, 2 of my favorite things. Then you must be Parisian, Marcel said with a small smile. The man chuckled. Born and stubbornly so, though my bones wish I'd been born somewhere drier. Colette brought 2 cups of cocoa and a small plate of autumn cakes. These just came out of the oven. They're sweeter if you eat them slowly. The woman laughed. At our age, everything is slow. Marcel watched them quietly. Something in their presence, soothing the edges of the long day, the way they leaned toward one another, finishing each other's sentences, reminded him of evenings long ago, when Claire would sit across from him, flowers still on her hands, both of them too tired to talk, but unwilling to let silence win. The couple ate in small, careful bites. The man gestured toward the shelves. I remember this place, he said. Before the war, my brother used to bring me here. He said the baker's bread could cure any sorrow. Henri grinned. Then you've come to the right place. The recipe hasn't changed. The man nodded approvingly. Good. The world needs some things that don't change. Colette smiled. That's what we keep telling him, she said, nodding toward Marcel. The old woman sipped her cocoa, her eyes drifting to the framed photograph on the shelf, the one of Claire holding a tray of pastries by the open door. Is that her? She asked softly. Marcel's breath caught. Yes, that's Claire. She used to sell me bread, the woman said. Every Thursday morning, always remembered my name, even when I forgot to remember hers. Marcel's smile was tender. That was her gift. She treated names like secrets worth keeping. The woman reached out and touched his arm gently. You've kept her spirit well. He nodded once, unable to speak. Outside, the rain thickened again. The sound filled the small silence that followed, a calm rhythm that seemed to echo their shared thoughts. Henri began stacking chairs quietly, giving them space. Colette polished the counter with slow, careful motions. After a few minutes, the man set down his empty cup. It's a rare thing, he said softly, to find a place that feels the same after so many years. Thank you for keeping it open. Marcel inclined his head. It keeps itself open, I think. Some walls are stubborn. The woman smiled faintly. Stubbornness is a kind of love. They sat together a while longer, the three bakers and the two strangers, the rain outside turning the world to watercolor. The cat stretched near the fire, letting out a soft sigh that made everyone smile. Finally, the couple stood. The man reached into his coat pocket and placed a small coin on the counter. For your kindness, he said. Marcel pushed it back gently. Your story was payment enough. The man chuckled. Then we've both made a bad bargain. Colette wrapped a small loaf and handed it to them. For the walk home, she said. It's lighter than an umbrella, but works just as well against the cold. The woman accepted it with both hands. We'll be back, she promised, even if only to smell the air again. You'll find it waiting, Marcel said. When they left, the bell above the door gave a soft chime, the kind that lingers just a breath too long. The three of them watched as the couple disappeared down the narrow street, their figures blurring into the shimmer of rain. Henri broke the silence first. It's strange, isn't it, how people keep finding this place when they need it most? Marcel smiled. It's the bread. It remembers the hungry. Colette leaned on the counter, eyes distant. Or maybe it's the light. People walk toward warmth when the world feels cold. The rain grew steadier again, its rhythm comforting now, like a familiar lullaby. The clock above the door ticked toward 11. Henri began turning off the lamps one by one, leaving only the one above the counter, the one that burned softer, golden, eternal. Marcel remained by the window, his reflection merging with the glow outside. You know, he said quietly, when I opened this bakery, I thought I was keeping busy, but maybe I was just keeping time. Colette tilted her head. Time for what? For things to find their way back, he said. The rain pressed harder against the glass, and for a moment all three stood together in its music. The night felt full again, not noisy, not crowded, but full, the kind of fullness that asks for nothing and gives everything. And though no customer entered, the bell swayed softly in the draught. as if remembering the rhythm of those who had come before. Midnight crept slowly over Paris, though no one in the bakery seemed to notice the hour. The rain, which had softened to a whisper, began to gather strength again. Outside, the wind swept through the narrow streets, carrying with it the scent of the river and wet cobblestones. The world beyond the windows dimmed to silver and charcoal, while inside the golden light held steady, a beacon in the quiet storm. Henri latched the shutters, though they still rattled faintly with every gust. "It's turning fierce again." "Let it," Marcel replied, placing a fresh log in the stove. "We've enough warmth for the both of us." Colette pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders and looked out at the blurred reflections of the street. "It feels different tonight, like the rain is remembering something too." Marcel smiled at that, his eyes soft. "Maybe it's jealous of the stories we've been telling." The wind howled faintly, as if in answer. A loose shutter banged once before Henri secured it. The sound echoed briefly, startling the cat from its nap. It darted under the counter, tail puffed like a grey brush. "Poor thing," Colette said, crouching to coax it out. "Even the brave have their limits." "Not fear," Marcel said, checking the oven's flame. "Just respect for noise." Thunder rolled faintly in the distance, slow, deliberate, as though the sky were clearing its throat. The rain drummed harder on the awning, a relentless rhythm that blurred the edges of time. Henri leaned against the counter. "Do you think we'll have customers in a storm like this?" Marcel shook his head. "Not tonight. Only ghosts, and the very lost." Colette smiled faintly. "Then we'd better keep the kettle on for both." She moved to the stove, pouring water into the pot. The hiss of steam rose softly, blending with the rain's cadence. "What do ghosts drink, anyway?" she asked. "Memory," Marcel said, "served warm." "Then we've plenty of that." The clock ticked toward 12:30. The sound of the storm filled every pause, every breath, yet there was no heaviness in it, only intimacy, the feeling of being sealed safely within a world of rain and light. Marcel sat at the table by the window, unfolding Claire's letter once more. The ink looked almost alive in the lamplight, the curves of her handwriting smooth and certain. He traced one line with his fingertip, whispering the words under his breath. Colette watched from the counter. "Do you ever get tired of rereading it?" "Never," he said softly. "It changes each time. The words don't, but I do." Henri paused mid-motion. "That's how I feel about baking," he said. "The same recipe but a different bread every morning." "Then you're learning," Marcel said. The thunder sounded again, closer this time. A draft of cold air slipped through the crack in the door, flickering the lamp flame. Cornet rose and checked the latch. "It's holding," she said, though her voice carried a note of unease. Moments later, the bell above the door gave a single, hollow chime. Henri frowned. "Did you feel that?" The latch. Before he could finish, the door creaked open, just enough to let a narrow figure inside. A man stepped through the threshold, dripping from head to toe. His hat hung low over his eyes. His coat clung to him like wet paper. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Colette hurried forward, ever brave, ever kind. "Monsieur, you're soaked. Come in, please." The man nodded, but didn't speak. He removed his hat, revealing silver-streaked hair and tired eyes. "Merci," he murmured, voice low, roughened by weather and distance. Marcel rose slowly, studying him. You've come a long way. The man gave a weary smile. From Lyon, the train stopped before Orléans, so I walked the rest. Henri's eyes widened. That's 3 days on foot. 4. The man corrected gently. But I heard the rain was kind here. Colette hurried to fetch him a towel and a cup of coffee. You've heard right. He sat at the nearest table, hands trembling slightly. As he wrapped them around the cup, steam curled up, ghost-like. I used to live here once, he said, staring into the dark liquid, not in this street, but nearby. The smell, it hasn't changed. Marcel's brow furrowed. You've been here before. The man nodded. Long ago, my brother worked in a bakery, not unlike this one. Henri froze, his broom falling lightly against the wall. Your brother? The man looked up, and for the first time, his gaze steadied. Henri Lefebvre? He asked softly. Henri's breath caught. John? The stranger smiled faintly. You've grown older, little brother. Henri moved as if in a dream, crossing the space between them in 2 steps. They stood face to face for a long second, disbelief and recognition warring quietly between them before embracing. The sound of the rain filled the silence their words couldn't. Colette clapped her hands once, tears springing, uninvited to her eyes. You see, she said to Marcel, the rain brings everyone home. Marcel nodded slowly, his throat tightening. Even the ones who've forgotten the way. Henri pulled back, studying his brother's face. We thought you were gone, he said. We stopped hearing after the floods. John nodded. So did I. But letters have long memories. Henri laughed through the emotion that shook his voice. You always did know how to arrive dramatically. I learned from thunder, Jean said with a grin. Colette brought another cup, setting it before him. You'll want something sweet. Jean took a bite of the autumn cake, closing his eyes. I don't remember food tasting this alive. Marcel smiled. That's because you're remembering hunger at the same time. The brothers sat side by side, talking in low tones, fragments of the past, stitched together over coffee and rain. Marcel listened from the counter, every word filling the space with a quiet kind of music. Outside, the wind howled again, shaking the shutters. Lightning flared once across the rooftops, painting the street in white for half a heartbeat. The thunder that followed was deep, rolling, almost kind. Inside, no one flinched. The bakery held steady, its warmth unwavering. Jean leaned back, eyes soft with fatigue. I thought I'd find you asleep, he said. Henri shook his head. The ovens keep us awake. Jen smiled. Then I came home to the right place. Marcel poured him another cup. You'll rest here tonight. The rain's not done yet. Jane nodded, gratitude shining quietly through his exhaustion. If you don't mind the company of a ghost. Not at all, Marcel said. This place has been waiting for you. The wind roared once more, but inside the bakery, the sound seemed distant, no longer threatening, only vast. The storm outside had found its rhythm, and so had they, and when the thunder rolled again, it did not shake the windows. It harmonized with the hum of the ovens, the whisper of breath, and the small miracle of reunion. The storm had settled into its deepest rhythm, heavy and patient, the kind of rain that stitched itself into the night, rather than simply falling through it. The windows of the bakery were a blur of silver streaks. The lamplight outside swayed faintly, caught between wind and water. Inside, the air glowed golden still. The brothers sat side by side at the corner table, steam rising from their cups like faint ghosts of all the years they had missed. Henri stared at Jean, as if he were afraid the image might vanish if he blinked. "You walked all the way from Lyon," he said again, shaking his head. 4 days in this weather." Jane smiled, weariness softening his expression. "You would have done the same if you'd heard there was bread waiting for you." Marcel chuckled quietly from behind the counter. "We should put that on the sign. Bread worth walking 4 days for." Colette, who was refilling the sugar jars, laughed softly. "It's true though. Look what the rain brings when we least expect it." Jean looked around the bakery, his gaze tracing the walls, the shelves, the faint crack in the ceiling, where a beam of lamplight always slipped through. "It feels smaller than I remembered," he said, "and somehow larger at the same time." "That's what happens when a place fills itself with stories," Marcel replied. The walls learn to stretch. Henri leaned back in his chair, the lines around his eyes deepening as he smiled. "We have much to catch up on. Where did you go after the floods?" Jean hesitated, swirling the coffee in his cup. "South, mostly. I worked in vineyards, then in a small mill. I tried to write when I could, but letters got lost more often than they arrived." "They found their way here anyway," Henri said, nodding toward the envelopes, still resting on the shelf behind the counter. "Marcel kept them safe." Jean followed his gaze, something flickering behind his tired eyes. "Then you've been reading ghosts all this time?" "Not reading," Marcel said gently, "just keeping them company." The oven gave a soft pop, its warmth spreading through the air like a sigh. The smell of the earlier cakes still lingered, but now it was mingled with the deeper scent of yeast and salt. Marcel had begun preparing a new batch of dough, though his movements were slower, more thoughtful. Colette wiped her hands on her apron and approached the table. "Would you like to help?" she asked Jean. He blinked, surprised. "It's been years since I touched dough." "Then it's time to remember," Marcel said. "Bread forgives forgetfulness." Jean stood, stretching stiffly, and joined them at the counter. His hands trembled slightly as he pressed them into the flour, but soon the rhythm returned. Push, fold, turn. The movements were instinctive, half muscle memory, half prayer. The scent of yeast deepened, rich and alive. Henri watched, eyes bright. "Henri Bresson, you still remember," he said quietly. "Some things don't leave your hands," Jean replied. "They just wait." Colette smiled, handing him a towel. "You'll ruin that coat." He looked down at the flour, dusting his sleeves, and laughed.
"It's the best ruin I've had in years."
For a while, the 4 of them worked together, their motions blending into a soft choreography. Marcel shaped loaves, Colette brushed them with milk, Henri stoked the fire, and Jean kneaded the last batch with careful patience. The rain drummed its endless rhythm outside, a steady percussion to their quiet symphony. When the loaves were ready for the oven, Marcel stepped back. "Henri," he said softly, "why don't you and your brother share the honors?" Henri looked at Jean. "Like when we were boys." Jean smiled. "Only this time, let's not drop it." Together, they slid the tray into the oven. The heat glowed golden against their faces. Henri closed the door, and they stood side by side, the smell of rising bread wrapping around them like a memory that had never ended. Colette poured fresh cups of coffee for everyone. "To family," she said, raising her cup. Jean lifted his throat. finding one another again, Marcel added softly, to the rain that remembers what we forget. They drank in silence. The warmth of the cups seeped into their palms, and the sound of the rain softened as if listening. After a while, Jean leaned against the counter, his eyes half closed. "It feels strange," he said, "like I've been carrying the weight of silence all this time, and now it's decided to set itself down here." "That's what this place does," Marcel said. "It collects people's silences and turns them into warmth." Henri nodded. "We should write that on the wall too." Colette smiled. "I'll paint it tomorrow." The oven ticked quietly as the bread baked. The scent began to change, deepening into something rich and comforting. Jean closed his eyes and breathed it in. "Do you hear that?" he murmured. "What?" Henri asked. "The bread," John said softly. "It's singing." Marcel's eyes glimmered with understanding. "Ah, you remember." Colette tilted her head. "Bread sings?" Marcel nodded. "When the crust forms and the air inside expands, it hums a low sound like a heartbeat. You only hear it if you listen closely." They all leaned in. For a moment, between the whisper of the rain and the crackle of the fire, they heard it, the faint, rhythmic song of the loaves. It was the sound of patience, of time transforming into nourishment. Jean smiled. "It's the same song as when we were children." Henri's voice softened. "Then nothing's been lost at all." Marcel placed a hand on each of their shoulders. "You've both come back at the right time. The bakery remembers more than any of us do." Outside, thunder rumbled faintly again, but it felt distant, gentle, like a cat's purr rather than a growl. The rain eased into steady drops, silver threads weaving across the glass. When the loaves were ready, Marcel opened the oven. The heat rolled out in waves, carrying with it the scent of completion, the smell that meant morning was near, even though the night was far from over. Henri and Jean broke one loaf open between them. Steam rose, and the inside glowed golden. They each tore a piece and tasted it. "It's perfect," Henri said. John nodded, swallowing slowly. "It tastes like forgiveness." Marcel smiled. "That's how you know it's ready." They ate in quiet companionship, each bite an act of gratitude. Colette leaned against the counter, watching the three men with a gentle smile. The rain had slowed to a whisper again, and through the thin clouds above, the faintest moonlight touched the street. In that small corner of Paris, beneath the storm's lingering hush, the bakery felt like the heart of the world, steady, glowing, alive, and as the clock neared 1, the bell above the door moved slightly in the draught, as if stirred by invisible hands, chiming once, soft and low, like a secret promise that the night still had more to give. The storm outside had calmed to a fine mist, a quiet aftermath that hung over the street like breath on glass. Paris slept under a blanket of fog, the street lamps dimming to soft halos. Inside the bakery, the air was still heavy with the scent of baked bread and the slow crackle of the fire. Henri and Jean sat close together by the window, their chairs turned slightly toward one another, hands resting on their cups. They had been speaking for nearly an hour, fragments of childhood resurfacing between long pauses, laughter weaving through quiet disbelief. Marcel leaned on the counter, listening without interrupting. He didn't need to add words. The sound of reunion was its own kind of music. Colette sat opposite them, her chin resting in her hand, eyes bright and soft. You remember the dog, Henri was saying, the one that used to steal loaves from the back window. Jean laughed, his voice low and warm. How could I forget? You blamed me every time. You were always closer to the window. You were always closer to trouble, Jean replied, grinning. The brothers laughed again, their laughter blending with the faint hiss of the rain. Marcel smiled. If the dog had any sense, it would have come here. At least we'd have fed it properly. Maybe it did, Colette said. Maybe it's still around, reincarnated as a cat with better manners. The cat, hearing its name without knowing why, flicked its tail lazily and rolled onto its side, indifferent to the joke. Jean stretched, the weariness of travel finally catching up to him. You know, he said, I wasn't sure this place would still exist. So many shops are gone. Bombings, new owners, new streets. Marcel's gaze drifted toward the window, where a streak of rainlight traced down the glass. Places like this don't belong to time, he said. They belong to people who need them. Jean nodded slowly, his eyes softening. Then you've done something rare, Marcel. You've kept the world kind. Marcel smiled faintly. It's the yeast. It teaches humility. Henri rose to fetch another loaf. You can't feed philosophy to customers, monsieur. Then I'll feed them patience instead. As Henri sliced the bread, Colette stood to adjust the picture frame on the wall. The photograph of Claire holding a tray of pastries at the bakery's doorway. She dusted it gently with the corner of her apron. It's crooked again, she said. Jean turned at the name. Claire. Marcel nodded, eyes following the frame. My wife. She helped build this place. Every recipe worth remembering started with her hands. Jane approached the photograph slowly. The lamplight reflected across the glass, and for a moment his face and Claire's seemed to share the same space. Two ghosts meeting halfway between memory and presence. She looks kind, Jean said softly. She was, Marcel replied. She believed sweetness was proof of courage. Henri glanced over his shoulder. She was the one who created the autumn cakes, wasn't she? Yes, Marcel said. And the pepper blend. She said spice gives warmth direction. Colette smiled faintly. It's strange. Sometimes I feel like she's still here, like she's watching how we work. She is, Marcel said simply. Jean stared at the photograph a moment longer. Then, almost hesitantly, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small envelope, folded and worn with travel. I meant to give you this earlier, he said. It was among my things when I left Lyon. I didn't know what it was until tonight. Marcel took it gently. His name was written on the front in faded ink. The handwriting was Claire's. He looked up, his voice quiet. Where did you find it? Between the pages of an old ledger from the mill. Maybe someone took it by mistake. Maybe it followed me. Marcel's hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside was a photograph, smaller, older, its corners curling with age. It showed the bakery's front door, taken from the street. Claire stood beside it, smiling faintly, her apron dusted with flour. But there was something else in the picture too, a shadow, barely visible, of a young boy standing by the window. Jane leaned closer. That's me, he whispered. That day I first came to the door. She must have taken it. Marcel exhaled, slowly. She took pictures sometimes. Said she wanted proof, that kindness existed. Colette blinked back tears. She was right. Henry set down the knife quietly. So, all this time, the bakery was already collecting its stories. Marcel nodded. We just didn't know how many. He studied the photo again, his thumb brushing the edge where the image had begun to fade. She must have hidden this before the war, he said softly. Maybe she meant for it to be found. John's voice was gentle, and now it has. Marcel placed the photograph beside the framed one on the wall, aligning them carefully. The lamplight caught both images, turning them golden for a brief moment. There, Colette said, now she's never alone. For a time, none of them spoke. The rain filled the silence, steady and rhythmic, like the ticking of a watch. Henri poured a bit of wine from the small bottle they kept near the counter, a quiet toast for long nights. He filled 4 glasses and handed them out. To her, he said. To her, they echoed. Marcel raised his glass, but didn't drink immediately. He looked around the bakery, the faces of the living, the warmth of the room, the faint hum of the ovens. She used to say that every loaf carried a memory, he murmured. If that's true, then we've baked enough to remember her forever. They drank in silence. The wine was simple but warm, the kind that spoke softly rather than sang. Outside, the wind brushed past again, stirring the air just enough to make the doorbell tremble faintly. It didn't ring, only swayed, as though someone invisible had stepped close, but not yet entered. Colette smiled at the sound. Maybe she's saying good night, or good morning, Marcel said, glancing toward the clock. It was almost 2. Jung looked at the photograph again. Whatever it is, she's still part of the story. Marcel nodded, his eyes lingering on the faint image of her face. She always will be. The rain softened to a mist, a whisper against the glass. The city beyond the window seemed suspended between night and dawn. Henri dimmed the lamps, leaving only one burning near the photograph. Its glow reflected on the glass, like a candle lit for memory. And in that moment, with the smell of bread cooling, the echo of laughter fading, and the soft hum of rain returning, the bakery felt almost eternal, held together by warmth, remembrance, and the quiet promise that nothing kind is ever truly lost. The first hint of dawn had not yet come, but something in the air had changed. The rain had stopped entirely, leaving behind a silence so complete that it almost startled them. The bakery stood cocooned in that hush, the kind that only follows a long storm. The last lamp burned steadily, its golden light soft against the polished counter, and the faint warmth of the ovens pulsed like a heartbeat through the floorboards. Colette was the first to notice. "Listen," she whispered. Henri paused mid-sentence. "To what?" "The nothing," she said. "Even the city's asleep." Jean, half dozing in his chair, smiled. "That's Paris catching her breath." Marcel nodded. The rain finally gave her permission. He stood by the window, looking out. The street beyond was washed clean. Every cobblestone gleamed under the lamplight, and puddles mirrored the quiet facades of the buildings. Smoke drifted lazily from a distant chimney. It was the kind of stillness that belonged to the hour before the world begins again. "Should we close up?" Henri asked softly. "Not yet," Marcel said, the bread still singing. Indeed, from the ovens came a faint crackle, like soft applause. The scent of freshly baked loaves filled the room once more. Deep, nutty, alive, Colette smiled, rubbing her tired eyes. I think I could live inside this smell forever. You already do, Marcel said. That's what bakers forget. We're always inside our own making. Henri chuckled. That sounds philosophical for 2 in the morning. I'm allowed philosophy, Marcel said. It's cheaper than sleep. They all laughed quietly. The kind of laughter that comes easily after long hours shared in warmth. Jean rose slowly, stretching his back. When I was walking here, he said, I kept thinking about what I'd say if I actually found this place again. But now that I'm here, I think silence says it better. Marcel nodded. Then let silence speak for a while. He turned down the last lamp slightly, leaving the bakery bathed in a golden twilight. For several minutes, none of them spoke. They listened to the faint tick of the clock, the soft settling of the wood, the echo of the storm fading into memory. Then, softly, the bell above the door chimed. It wasn't the sharp ring of an entrance, but a gentle sound, like a breeze brushing through a wind chime. All 4 of them turned toward the door. No one stood there. The latch moved slightly, though no wind touched it. The bell swayed once more, slower this time. The air shifted, a soft current of warmth, carrying the faint scent of orange peel and pepper. Colette's eyes widened. Do you smell that? Henri nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. The autumn cakes. Marcel didn't move. His hands rested on the counter, still as stone. Claire, he murmured. The others said nothing. They simply waited, the silence stretching like a held breath. The air grew warmer near the ovens, as if someone had opened them again. A single loaf, one they hadn't baked, sat cooling on the counter. Its crust was darker, its shape a little uneven, but it gleamed faintly in the lamplight, steam curling from its seam.
Colette gasped softly. That wasn't there before.
Marcel approached slowly, reverently. His hand trembled as he reached toward it. He didn't touch it right away, only hovered his palm above it, feeling the gentle heat. Her hands, he whispered. That's her shaping. Jean exchanged a look with Henri, both unsure whether to speak or breathe. What does it mean? Colette asked, her voice barely a sound. Marcel smiled faintly, eyes glistening. It means memory keeps its promises. He sliced the loaf carefully. The knife slid through without resistance, revealing a soft crumb inside. The smell that rose was unmistakable. Cinnamon, nutmeg, a hint of orange, and that whisper of black pepper that made sweetness feel awake. He handed each of them a small piece. Eat, he said simply. They did. The taste was warmth itself, simple, impossible, and whole. For a moment, they all closed their eyes. The flavors folded around them like a blanket, and with it came the feeling that someone unseen was smiling nearby. When they opened their eyes again, the loaf was gone. Only a few crumbs remained, faint steam still curling from the wood. Henri set his empty plate down, voice hushed. She came home. Marcel nodded slowly, just long enough to remind us how, outside, the first hint of dawn brushed the horizon. The grey sky began to pale, and the street took on that quiet shimmer that belongs only to early morning after rain. Jean turned toward the window. It's morning already. The world begins again, Marcel said. Colette leaned her head on her arms, smiling through tears. She didn't try to hide. I don't think I'll ever forget this night. You're not meant to, Marcel said. It will live in the bread tomorrow. The clock chimed softly. 4:30. The sound was clear and kind, like the final note of a lullaby. Henri began tidying the tables, though his movements were slow, thoughtful. Jean refilled the wood in the stove, even though it no longer needed it. Colette washed the last of the cups, her humming quiet but steady. Marcel stood by the counter, staring at the space where the loaf had been. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then he whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." No reply came, but the light through the window brightened slightly, touching his face with a warmth that didn't feel entirely like dawn. When he turned, he saw that the others were watching him. "It's time," he said gently. "Let's open early." Henri blinked. "Already?" "Yes. The city will be hungry." Jean smiled, and ready for kindness. They unlocked the door. The bell chimed once, sweet and soft. Outside, the puddles shimmered in the newborn light, and a few early risers crossed the street, their umbrellas still dripping. Marcel looked back at the bakery one last time before stepping behind the counter again. The photograph of Claire caught the first light of morning, glowing faintly as though it too were waking. "Bienvenue," he whispered to the day, and as the first customer entered, a young woman carrying flowers, smiling at the smell of bread, the rain began again, light and playful, as if to say that some stories never end. They simply change rhythm. By the time the sky turned the color of diluted milk, the bakery was already alive again. The rain had become a thin drizzle, soft, forgiving, more like a memory of the night than its continuation. Paris was stretching awake. The rumble of a tram echoed faintly, mingled with the call of a street vendor, setting out baskets of apples. Inside, the scent of bread and sugar mingled with that first breath of morning air. Marcel stood behind the counter, his sleeves rolled up, a clean apron tied neatly around his waist. Colette arranged croissants in the display window, each one glistening under the lamplight like a promise. Henri busied himself by the ovens, humming a low tune that blended with the rhythm of his work. Jean sat by the window with a cup of coffee, his coat folded neatly beside him. He looked out at the waking street where puddles reflected the pale light of dawn, and a newsboy bicycled past with a bag of papers. The world looked new, as though the storm had washed away everything unnecessary. "You'll stay, won't you?" Henri asked from across the room. Jane turned. "For a while. There's no hurry to leave anymore." "Good," Henri said, smiling. "It's strange to think how easily the world can lose someone, and how quietly it can find them again." Marcel nodded. "The finding always happens in small places." Colette glanced over her shoulder. "Like this one." She placed the last croissant carefully and stepped back to admire her work. The window looked like a painting, gold and glass, warmth framed by rain. Outside, a man paused to look in, tipping his hat with a faint smile, before continuing down the street. "See," she said softly, "the light's already working." The door opened with its familiar chime. The young woman with the flowers stepped inside, shaking off her umbrella. The scent of rain and lavender filled the air. "Bonjour," Marcel said warmly. "You're our first this morning." She smiled. "Then I'm lucky." The smell drew me in from halfway down the street. Henri grinned. "That's how we trap people, ambush them with kindness." The woman laughed, setting her bouquet on the counter. "Then I surrender. 2 brochanges, please, and whatever that cake is that smells like autumn itself." Colette wrapped the pastries carefully. "It's new," she said, "or very old. Depends on how you look at it." The woman tilted her head. "That's a lovely way to describe something. I'll remember it." She paid, thanked them, and left with a soft rustle of petals and paper. The bell chimed again, echoing lightly through the room as she disappeared into the mist. Jean exhaled. I'd forgotten what mornings feel like. They're quieter after a night like this, Marcel said. Colette poured him a fresh cup of coffee, and sweeter. He smiled. You're right. The sweetness is everywhere, even in the tiredness. Henri leaned against the counter. You'll help us bake tomorrow, then? Jean hesitated, then nodded. If you'll let me. My hands remember more than I thought. They'll remember even better with dough, Marcel said. The clock ticked softly above the doorway. The rhythm of work continued, measured, unhurried. Colette swept the floor. Henri checked the ovens, and Marcel began shaping a new batch of rolls. His movements steady and precise. Jean rose to join him, falling into the familiar pattern without needing instruction. Outside, the drizzle brightened into silver threads under the growing light. A tram bell rang from the corner, followed by the soft chatter of early shoppers. The bakery door opened again and again, each chime a reminder that the world, though weary, was still turning toward warmth. A soldier with damp boots bought a loaf and left quietly. An old woman came in for coffee and stayed to talk about the rain. Two children pressed their noses to the glass before giggling and running off, their laughter trailing behind them like music. By 8 o'clock, the counter was nearly bare. Colette refilled the jars of jam. We'll need more butter before noon. Henri nodded. I'll fetch it after deliveries. Marcel wiped his hands on his apron. Bring some oranges too. I think the season's turned. He said it almost absently, but Colette caught the weight of it, the unspoken layer beneath his tone. She smiled softly. It has. I can feel it. Jane took a seat again, his gaze drifting toward the photograph on the wall. She would have liked this morning, he said quietly. Marcel followed his eyes. She's here for it, always was. The bakery grew still for a moment, their shared silence as gentle as prayer. Then the bell chimed again. A man entered, a postal clerk with a satchel slung across his shoulder. He tipped his cap politely. Delivery, he said. Marcel blinked. At this hour, the man shrugged, smiling. We had a backlog after the storm. This one was marked urgent. He handed over a small, cream-coloured envelope, slightly damp from the rain. The handwriting was neat, but unfamiliar. Marcel wiped his hands before taking it. Merci, he said. The clerk nodded and left, the bell chiming once more. Colette leaned close. Another letter? Yes, Marcel murmured, turning it over in his hands. There was no return address, only his name and the bakery's. He hesitated a moment, then opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the ink slightly smudged but legible. It read, For the baker who kept the light alive, thank you. I found your bread after 30 years, and it tasted the same. Some warmth never fades. There was no signature. Marcel read it twice, then folded it neatly. Someone remembered, he said softly. Colette's voice was tender. Then the warmth worked. He smiled. It always does. Eventually, he placed the letter beside the others on the shelf, each one a story, a whisper of the lives that had passed through their door. The stack had grown over the years, But this one, he laid on top. Outside, the clouds began to thin, and a sliver of sunlight broke through, brushing gold across the wet cobblestones. Henri leaned back, watching it. Clear skies at last. Joan smiled. Maybe not forever, but long enough. Marcel looked toward the window. The sunlight reflected in his eyes. That's all anyone ever needs. Just long enough to see the light return. The bell chimed again. Another customer entered, bringing with her the scent of rain-soaked violets and the murmur of the street. And as the morning continued, the bakery kept its rhythm. Knead, bake, serve, smile. Its heartbeat steady beneath the hum of a waking city, its warmth stretching beyond its walls like sunlight after a storm. By mid-morning, the rain had disappeared entirely, leaving behind streets that gleamed like new porcelain. The world outside the bakery seemed lighter, cleaner, the kind of day that feels like an apology after too much grey. Steam still curled faintly from the gutters, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of wet stone and roasted chestnuts from a vendor down the street. Inside, the bakery pulsed with quiet energy. The ovens hummed again, trays clattered gently, and the smell of butter had reclaimed its place as the dominant perfume of Rue de la Madeleine. Customers came and went in a slow, unhurried rhythm, their shoes squeaking faintly on the drying floor. Marcel worked without hurry, shaping dough into careful spirals. His movements were graceful now, almost meditative. Beside him, Henri and Jean worked shoulder to shoulder, their gestures in sync as though they had never been apart. Philette moved through the space like sunlight, handing out pastries, wiping counters, humming a tune that had no words but somehow belonged to the morning. Every so often, Marcel glanced at the photograph on the wall. The way the early light touched it made it seem almost alive, as though Claire herself were leaning forward from her frame, amused to find her bakery still bustling, still breathing warmth into strangers. By 11, the place was full. Two painters argued good-naturedly near the window over the price of pigment. A young couple shared a single croissant, laughing quietly as they fed each other small bites. A policeman sipped his coffee by the door, his cap hanging on the chair beside him. The cat wandered between chairs like a matador, pausing only when someone slipped it a crumb. "Feels different today," Colette whispered to Henri as she passed. He nodded. "Feels like the world's forgiven itself." Marcel smiled at their words. "That's what bread is for," he said softly. "To remind us that we can start over." The bell above the door chimed again. A little boy entered, clutching a coin in his hand. His coat was too big, his cap slightly askew. He stood on his toes to see over the counter. "Bonjour, monsieur," he said shyly. "My maman says your bread smells like home." Marcel's heart tightened. "Then she must have a good home," he replied. "She says she used to come here before I was born." The boy continued. "Can I buy a small loaf for her?" "Of course," Marcel said, selecting one of the golden loaves from the cooling rack. "This one has extra kindness in it." The boy grinned, his coin clutched tightly in his small hand. "She'll like that." Colette wrapped the loaf neatly in paper, tying it with a bit of string. "Tell your maman we remember her," she said gently. The boy nodded solemnly and ran out into the bright street, his footsteps echoing against the cobblestones. The door closed softly behind him, and for a moment the entire bakery seemed to exhale a shared invisible smile. John leaned against the counter. "You see, that's the magic of what you've built here, Marcel. It reaches farther than you think. Marcel shook his head modestly. It's not magic, just warmth. Warmth knows where to go. Henri poured coffee for the group, filling 4 small cups. Then, let's toast to warmth, he said. They raised their cups, the steam curling upward like invisible threads, connecting them to all those who had come before, and all those yet to enter. To warmth, Colette said. To return, Jean added. To bread, Henri finished. Marcel smiled. To memory. They drank, and for a few seconds, the sound of conversation and clinking cups filled the air like a soft orchestra. The moment stretched, perfect and whole. Then the door opened again, and a soft gust of air swept in, carrying with it the faint scent of orange peel and black pepper. Colette froze. Do you smell that? Henri nodded slowly. The autumn blend. Marcel turned toward the open door, where no one stood. The street beyond shimmered with light, the air golden, the puddles glinting like glass. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw her, Claire standing at the corner of the street, her silhouette small but unmistakable, her hair caught in the morning breeze. He didn't move. He didn't need to. The sight wasn't for chasing, it was for remembering. She lifted her hand once, just a gentle wave, the same gesture she'd given every passerby, every stranger who needed it. Then the light shifted, and she was gone. Colette saw where he looked, but said nothing. She only smiled, a quiet, knowing smile, and returned to her tray. Jean approached the window, following his gaze. You saw her, didn't you? Marcel nodded once. She looked well. The older brother didn't press further. Some things, he understood, are too sacred for questions. By noon, the bakery began to empty. Customers left with their loaves wrapped carefully against their chests, as though carrying something more fragile than bread. Outside, sunlight filtered through the thinning clouds, turning the wet streets to mirrors. Jean and Henri took a moment to rest, leaning against the counter, both wearing the tired, contented smiles of men who had worked hard and found peace in it. Colette refilled the sugar bowl and set a plate of small cakes by the window. We'll sell out before evening, she said. Marcel smiled. Then we'll bake again tomorrow. He turned toward the back of the bakery, pausing for a moment before speaking again. You know, he said softly, I think the bread tastes better after storms. Henri looked up. Because we're hungrier. Marcel shook his head. Because we remember what comfort means. Jean nodded thoughtfully. And because it reminds us the world keeps starting over. Marcel smiled, setting his hands on the counter. That's what baking really is. Just another way of beginning again. Outside, a tram passed, its wheels humming softly against the rails. A few leaves skittered across the street, golden and damp. The light had changed again, brighter now, full of quiet promise. Colette leaned against the doorway, looking out. The city smells new, she said. It is, Marcel replied. Every morning it chooses to be. And as he spoke, the bell above the door chimed one more time. Another customer stepped inside. An old man with a newspaper tucked under his arm, smiling faintly at the scent of bread. Marcel greeted him with the same words he always had, words that had outlived years and storms alike. Bienvenue. You're just in time. The man smiled. For what? For the bread of memory, Marcel said. It's best when it's warm. The old man nodded. and the door closed softly behind him. The rain had stopped for good, but its memory lingered in the scent of flour, the gleam of windows, and the steady rhythm of hands working together. A quiet, ongoing hymn to belonging. The afternoon light slanted gently through the front windows, turning the flour dust in the air into drifting gold. The rain was gone, truly gone this time, leaving only the faint scent of damp stone and the echo of water retreating through gutters. Paris had returned to its usual rhythm, the hum of trams, the laughter from cafes, the flutter of pigeons reclaiming the rooftops. Inside the bakery, the heat of the ovens had softened. The loaves stood in quiet rows, cooling on wooden racks like small suns. Every surface gleamed faintly, wiped clean, yet still alive with the day's work. The world had resumed. But here, in this corner of Rue de la Madeleine, time felt slower, as if the bakery itself were taking one last deep breath before evening. Henri sat by the counter, polishing a tray, the steady motion of his cloth a kind of music. Jean packed the last of the morning's bread for delivery. Careful and unhurried, Colette refilled the sugar jars, her sleeves rolled up, a smudge of flour on her cheek that she didn't seem to notice, and Marcel, quiet, composed Marcel, stood by the window, gazing at the street where the puddles had turned into mirrors for the late sun. The air was filled with that soft exhaustion only peace can bring. Jean was the first to speak. Do you ever wonder how many lives have passed through here? Marcel didn't turn. I try not to count, he said softly. Some moments lose their grace when you number them. Henri smiled faintly. And yet they leave their scent behind. Colette nodded. Like sugar on a pan gone, but not really. They all chuckled. The sound warm, familiar. Outside, a delivery boy passed by on his bicycle, tossing newspapers onto stoops. The echo of his bell rang through the street. Marcel watched him for a moment, then turned back to his companions. We'll close early today, he said. You've earned the quiet. Henri raised an eyebrow. And what will you do with your share of quiet? Marcel smiled, a tired but content smile. Listen to it. Jane laughed softly. You've turned it into an art form. Marcel shrugged. When you've spent your life feeding people, silence becomes dessert. They finish their small tasks, one by one. Colette cleaned the counter until it shone, her reflection faint in the polished surface. Henri swept the floor, humming that same melody he always returned to when his mind was still full of dough and memory. Jean washed the cups, his movements slow and deliberate, as though afraid to end the rhythm of the day. When all was done, they sat together for a moment. Colette poured tea into mismatched cups, setting them carefully on the table near the window. The sound of pouring filled the small space like rain remembered. To a good day, Henri said, raising his cup. To the rain that brought it, Jean added. To the hands that made it warm, Colette finished. Marcel lifted his cup last. And to the hearts that stayed long enough to see it, they drank. The tea was simple, strong and sweet, with a hint of orange peel from the morning's baking. It felt like continuity in liquid form, the taste of something ordinary made extraordinary by the act of sharing it. Afterward, they sat in silence. The light in the room shifted again, turning softer, redder. Dust motes floated lazily through the air, catching the last glow of the sun. The cat jumped onto a chair and curled into a perfect spiral, its breathing steady and slow. Will you keep the bakery open forever? Colette asked suddenly. Marcel smiled at the question.
Forever is too long for bread, but I'll keep it warm as long as I can.
Jane looked around the room. And after? After, Marcel said gently. Someone else will remember. The words settled between them. Neither heavy nor sad, just true. A few minutes later, Colette went to fetch her coat. Then began stacking chairs, and Jean stood near the door, watching the sky fade into the colour of copper. The street outside glowed faintly under the evening lamps. The rain might have left, but the light still carried its reflection. Marcel approached the counter one last time. There, among the stacked letters and small ledger, lay a single folded note, the one that had arrived that morning. He opened it again, rereading the simple words. For the baker who kept the light alive, thank you. He smiled and placed it carefully beneath the glass of the counter, alongside the others that had defined his years. Messages from strangers, fragments of gratitude, traces of lives that had crossed paths with flower and rain. Together they formed a quiet archive of warmth. As he smoothed the paper, he noticed something faintly new beneath it. A small smudge of flour in the shape of a fingerprint. Not his, not Colette's, not Henri. Smaller, lighter. He didn't move it. The bell above the door swayed once in a passing breeze. The sound was soft, almost tentative, like a whisper returning home. Marcel looked up and out toward the street. A child ran past, laughing, a mother calling after him. Somewhere a piano played faintly, its notes mingling with the hum of the city. Paris was alive, unchanged and changing all at once. He turned back to the bakery. The air still held the faint scent of orange peel and spice. The photograph on the wall caught one last ray of light, and for a fleeting instant, Claire's face seemed to glow, her smile warm and knowing. Marcel exhaled, long and slow. Bonsoir, mon amour, he murmured. The others didn't hear him. They were busy gathering their coats and closing the shutters. But the air seemed to shift in answer, carrying the faintest echo of her laughter, soft as rain. When the lights were finally dimmed, the bakery remained bathed in the amber of the street lamp outside. Through the window, passers-by could still see the shape of bread cooling on the racks, the curve of chairs waiting for morning, and the faint outline of 4 cups left to dry beside the sink. Henri locked the door, and the bell gave its final chime of the day. See you tomorrow, Colette whispered. Tomorrow, Marcel said. Always tomorrow. They stepped into the street. The night was cool, but kind. The kind of evening that promised calm instead of restlessness. Behind them, the bakery glowed like a lantern, a small patch of warmth stitched into the fabric of a vast city. And as they walked away, the scent of bread drifted out into the Parisian air, mingling with the memory of rain. Somewhere, a window closed softly. Somewhere, a new story began. The bell inside the bakery swayed once more, though no one had touched it, its gentle ring blending with the distant hum of the waking night. And in that moment, everything light, scent, memory, silence folded together perfectly, like dough finding its shape under patient hands. The warmth that remained was not of ovens, but of souls.